Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let me take you on a journey through time, back to when half of humanity lived in shadows cast by the very civilizations we celebrate today. Close your eyes and imagine walking through the ancient streets of Babylon, Athens, or Rome. But this time, we're seeing the world through the eyes of those who built these societies, yet rarely owned their own lives. The women of antiquity. Their stories have been whispered through millennia, carried on desert winds and Mediterranean breezes, waiting for us to finally listen. For thousands of years, from the earliest settlements along the Euphrates to the marble columns of the Roman Forum, women navigated a world that was both magnificent and merciless. They were queens and slaves, priestesses and property, mothers and merchants. Their stories are written in fragments, scattered across clay tablets, whispered in myths, and carved into laws that reveal as much by what they forbid as by what they permit. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the steady rhythm of ancient knowledge guide you into peaceful rest. Tonight, we'll explore these forgotten chapters of human history. Let the gentle rhythm of these ancient tales carry you toward rest, as we uncover the daily realities, the quiet rebellions, and the enduring strength of women who lived in civilizations, both brilliant and brutal. These are not just historical accounts, but deeply human stories of love, loss, hope, and survival that transcend the boundaries of time itself. Picture the world's first cities rising from the marshy plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Mud brick buildings stretch toward the sky, their walls baked hard by the relentless Mesopotamians. Cuneiform scribes press their reed styluses into clay tablets, recording humanity's first written laws, contracts, and stories. The air is thick with the scent of burning olive oil lamps and the sound of merchants haggling in the market. Here, in humanity's earliest urban centers, we find the first detailed records of women's lives. The Code of Ur-Nammu, dating to around 2100 BCE, tells us much about how society viewed women. They were classified into distinct categories: wives, concubines, slaves, and the rare few who served as priestesses. Each category came with its own restrictions, expectations, and forms of protection or vulnerability. A Sumerian woman's life was largely determined by her father's status and wealth, and later by her husband's will and economic circumstances. Marriage was fundamentally a business transaction, often arranged when girls were barely past childhood. The bride price, called tahatu, was paid by the groom's family to the bride's father. This wasn't a dowry to help the couple start their new life together, but rather compensation for the loss of a daughter's labor and the promise of her future children who would belong to her husband's lineage. Let us imagine Ninlil, a fictional but representative Sumerian woman, born into a middle-class family in the city of Ur, around 2000 BC. At age 13, she would have been considered ready for marriage. Her father, perhaps a skilled bronze worker, would have negotiated with the family of Enlil, a young merchant, for her hand. The negotiations would have involved not just the bride price, but also discussions about the dowry Ninlil would bring to the marriage, consisting of household goods, jewelry, and perhaps a slave girl to serve as her personal attendant. Ninlil's wedding ceremony would have been elaborate, lasting several days and involving rituals designed to ensure fertility and prosperity. She would have worn her finest garments, including elaborate headdress similar to those found in the royal tombs of Ur, though made of copper rather than gold. The ceremony would have included the ritual sharing of dates and honey, symbols of sweetness and fertility, and the blessing of the household gods who would watch over the new family. The daily life of a Sumerian woman like Ninlil was one of constant, demanding labor. She would wake before dawn, while the air was still cool, to begin the day's work. Her first task would be grinding barley for bread, a process that could take several hours and required enormous physical strength. The grinding stones were heavy, and the repetitive motion left many women with severely worn-down teeth from the stone grit that inevitably made its way into the grain. Archaeological evidence from Sumerian burials shows that women's teeth were often ground down to the gums by middle age from this daily task. After preparing the grain, Ninlil would tend to the household's bread making. Bread was the staple food, and its preparation was both an art and a science. She would knead the dough, adding water from the household's precious supply, shape the loaves, and bake them in the mud brick oven that dominated one corner of the courtyard. The bread had to be perfect. Too little water and it would be hard as stone. Too much and it would crumble. A woman's reputation often rested on the quality of her bread. Beyond bread making, Ninil would be responsible for brewing beer, another crucial household task. Beer was safer to drink than water, and was consumed by everyone, including children. The brewing process was complex, requiring the preparation of barley bread that was then fermented in large ceramic vats. The beer had to be strained through baskets to remove the solid matter, and its strength had to be carefully controlled. Too weak and it wouldn't keep too strong, and it would be wasted on daily consumption. Weaving was another of Ninil's primary responsibilities. She would spend hours each day spinning wool or linen into thread, using a spindle that she would carry with her wherever she went. The thread would then be woven into cloth on a large loom that took up significant space in the household. The cloth she produced wasn't just for her own family's use, but was often traded for other goods or sold in the market. A woman's skill with the loom was considered one of her most valuable assets, and mothers took great pride in teaching their daughters the intricate patterns and techniques that had been passed down through generations. Childbirth was both a Sumerian woman's primary duty and her greatest danger. The mortality rate for both mothers and infants was staggering, perhaps as high as 20% for mothers and 40% for infants. Clay tablets from the period contain numerous prayers to Ninil, the goddess of childbirth, and to Gula, the goddess of healing, begging for safe delivery. Women who failed to produce children, particularly sons, could face divorce, abandonment, or the humiliation of watching their husbands take additional wives or concubines. The legal system of Sumer provides a stark window into women's restricted lives. The Code of Hammurabi, dating to around 1750 BCE, reflects the attitudes that had developed over centuries of urban civilization. A woman could be divorced for adultery, and the punishment was often death by drowning in the sacred river. The accused woman would be bound and thrown into the water. If she survived, she was considered innocent, but survival was rare. However, if a man was unfaithful, it was merely a personal matter between him and his wife, with no legal consequence. Women couldn't initiate divorce except in the most extreme circumstances, such as if their husbands abandoned them or failed to provide basic necessities. They had limited rights to property or inheritance, and what they did inherit was often managed by male relatives. A woman's testimony in court was worth less than a man's, and she could not serve as a witness in many types of legal proceedings. The concept of honor was central to Sumerian society, and women bore the primary responsibility for maintaining their family's reputation. A woman's behavior reflected not just on herself but on her father, her husband, and her sons. She was expected to be modest in dress and behavior, to avoid unnecessary contact with men outside her family, and to conduct herself with dignity at all times. The pressure to conform to these expectations was enormous, and women who violated social norms faced severe consequences. Yet even within these harsh constraints, some women found ways to wield influence and create meaningful lives. The Naditu were priestesses who chose religious service over marriage. They lived in temple complexes called gagam, where they formed close-knit communities with other women. These women could own property, conduct business, and even adopt children to carry on their names and inherit their wealth. They were essentially creating alternative families based on choice rather than blood or marriage. The Naditu were often daughters of wealthy families who couldn't or wouldn't marry for various reasons. Some may have been physically disabled, others may have been too independent for the marriage market, and still others may have felt a genuine religious calling. Whatever their reasons, they found in temple service a way to live with dignity and purpose outside the traditional roles of wife and mother. These women conducted important religious ceremonies, managed temple property, and served as intermediaries between the human and divine world. They were often well educated, able to read and write cuneiform, and some became skilled in mathematics and astronomy. Their lives were regulated by strict rules about behavior and dress, but within those boundaries, they enjoyed freedoms that married women could not imagine. The goddess Inanna, known later as Ishtar, was one of the most powerful deities in the Sumerian pantheon. Her myths tell of a goddess who was both nurturing and destructive, who demanded respect from both gods and mortals, and who refused to be controlled by male authority. In one famous myth, Inanna descends to the underworld to challenge her sister Ereshkigal, demonstrating a courage and independence that mortal women were forbidden to display. The story of Inanna's descent resonated deeply with Sumerian women, who saw in her a reflection of their own struggles against limitation and control. When Inanna returns from the underworld, she is changed, more powerful but also more dangerous. Perhaps these stories provided comfort to women who felt trapped by their circumstances, offering them a vision of divine feminine power that transcended earthly constraints. Religious festivals provided some of the few opportunities for women to participate in public life. During the New Year celebration, women would carry offerings to the temple and participate in ritual meals. The festival of Inanna included processions where women could sing and dance in public, expressing emotions and creativity that were normally suppressed. These events were carefully regulated and temporary, but they offered brief glimpses of a different way of being. The economic life of Sumerian cities depended heavily on women's labor, though this contribution was rarely acknowledged or rewarded. Women not only maintained households but also participated in textile production, food processing, and various crafts. The temple workshops employed hundreds of women who produced goods for trade, contributing significantly to the city's wealth. Yet these women remained under the authority of male overseers and received only basic subsistence in return for their labor. Slavery was a fundamental part of Sumerian society, and women slaves faced particularly harsh conditions. They could be bought, sold, and inherited like any other property. Female slaves were often used for domestic labor, textile production, and sexual services. They had no rights whatsoever, and could be punished, sold, or even killed at their owner's whim. The children of female slaves belonged to the owner, and slave women had no legal claim to their own offspring. The archaeological record provides poignant evidence of women's lives in ancient Sumer. Graves contained spindle whorls, loom weights, and grinding stones, the tools of their daily labor. Jewelry found in women's burials shows both the artistry of Sumerian craftsmen and the importance placed on female beauty and status. The famous headdress of Queen Puabi, discovered in the royal cemetery of Ur, demonstrates the heights of luxury that some women could achieve, though such examples were extraordinarily rare. Medical texts from the period reveal the health challenges that Sumerian women faced. Childbirth complications, malnutrition, and the physical toll of constant labor created a host of medical problems. Women's life expectancy was significantly lower than men's, and many died in their 20s or 30s. The medical treatments available were limited and often ineffective, consisting mainly of herbal remedies and religious rituals. As we listen to these ancient stories from Mesopotamia, let them wash over you like the waters of the Euphrates, carrying you deeper into the peaceful realm of sleep. The struggles of these long-ago women, while distant in time, remind us of the enduring human desire for dignity, respect, and the right to determine one's own fate. Their voices, preserved in clay and stone, continue to whisper across the millennia, telling us of lives lived with courage and grace despite overwhelming obstacles. Let us now drift along the life-giving Nile, where the great pyramids cast their eternal shadows across a land that was, in many ways, more progressive toward women than its neighbors, yet still bound by rigid social hierarchies and expectations that shaped every aspect of female existence. Ancient Egypt, spanning over 3 millennia, from the early dynastic period around 3100 BCE to the Roman conquest in 30 BCE, presents us with a complex and evolving picture of women's lives. Unlike in Mesopotamia, Egyptian women could own property, initiate divorce, and even rule as pharaoh. Yet these privileges came with their own burdens and limitations, and they were largely restricted to the upper classes. The vast majority of Egyptian women lived lives of agricultural labor, domestic service, and a constant struggle for survival in a land that was both blessed and cursed by the rhythm of the Nile. The life of an Egyptian woman was intrinsically tied to the annual flooding of the Nile, the inundation that brought both life and disruption to the valley. During the flood season from July to October, when the river overflowed its banks and work in the fields was impossible, women would engage intensively in textile production. They would spin flax into linen thread, weave cloth, and create the fine white garments that became synonymous with Egyptian civilization. This work was not merely domestic craft, but a crucial part of Egypt's economy, as Egyptian linen was prized throughout the ancient world. Consider the story of Ankhesenamun, the daughter of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten and the wife of the boy king Tutankhamun. Historical records and archaeological evidence suggests that after her young husband's death, around 1323 BCE, she found herself in a desperate situation. As a royal widow without male heirs, she was expected to marry someone chosen by the court officials to legitimize their claim to the throne. Her letter to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma III, preserved in the Hittite archives, reveals the desperation of even a queen faced with limited options. "My husband has died, and I have no sons. People say that you have many sons. If you send me one of your sons, he could become my husband and king of Egypt." This letter is remarkable, not just for its historical significance, but for what it reveals about the constraints faced by even the most powerful women in ancient Egypt. Ankhesenamun was educated, wealthy, and had held the highest position a woman could achieve, yet she was still ultimately dependent on male protection and approval. Her plea to a foreign king demonstrates the lengths to which women would go to maintain some control over their lives and their country's future. The daily life of an average Egyptian woman was governed by the rhythm of the Nile and the agricultural calendar. Let us imagine Nefertiti, not the famous queen but a common woman named after her, living in a village near Memphis around 1400 BC. She would wake before dawn, as the first light began to illuminate the eastern desert. Her day would begin with the preparation of bread and beer, the staples of the Egyptian diet that required hours of labor to produce properly. Bread making in ancient Egypt was a complex process that required both skill and endurance. Nefertiti would begin by grinding grain with a stone quern, a task that required her to kneel on a stone platform and use her entire body weight to crush the grain. The grinding stones were made of hard sandstone, and over time, small particles would wear off and mix with the flour. This gritty flour gradually wore down people's teeth, causing severe dental problems that are evident in Egyptian mummies. Many women died from infections that began as simple tooth decay. After grinding the grain, Nefertiti would mix the flour with water from the Nile to create dough. The consistency had to be perfect too, wet and the bread would be soggy, too dry and it would crumble. She would then shape the dough into loaves and bake them in mud brick ovens that were built into the courtyards of most Egyptian homes. The heat from these ovens was intense, and working around them during the hot Egyptian summers was exhausting and dangerous. Beer brewing was equally complex and time-consuming. Egyptian beer was thick and nutritious, more like liquid bread than modern beer. The process began with the preparation of barley bread that was only partially baked, leaving it soft and moist. This bread was then crumbled into large vats, mixed with water, and left to ferment. The fermentation process had to be carefully monitored. Too little time, and the beer would be weak and wouldn't keep too much, and it would be too strong for daily consumption. Once the beer had fermented properly, it had to be strained through baskets to remove the solid matter. This left a thick, nutritious beverage that was safe to drink and provided essential calories and nutrients. Every household brewed its own beer, and the quality of a woman's beer was considered a reflection of her domestic skills and character. Egyptian women faced unique challenges related to their appearance and social expectations. The elaborate beauty routines we associate with ancient Egypt were not merely vanity, but social and religious necessities. Kohl around the eyes wasn't just cosmetic. It protected against the harsh desert sun and glare from the Nile, and it was believed to have magical properties that could ward off evil spirits and diseases. The preparation of cosmetics was time-consuming and expensive, requiring ingredients like malachite, galena, and precious oils that had to be imported from distant lands. The process of applying makeup was ritualistic and time-consuming. Women would use copper or bronze mirrors, polished to a high shine, to see their reflections. They would grind minerals on stone pallets, mix them with oils and animal fats, and apply them with small sticks or their fingers. The green eye paint was made from malachite, the black from galena, and various shades of red from ochre and other minerals. The application had to be precise and symmetrical, as the gods were believed to judge people partly by their appearance. Hair care was equally important, and most Egyptian women wore their hair in elaborate styles that required hours of work and the assistance of servants or family members. Hair was braided, curled, and decorated with ornaments made of gold, silver, or fire. Many women wore wigs made from human hair, which were considered more hygienic and fashionable than natural hair. The wigs were styled and maintained by skilled wig makers who formed a specialized profession. Marriage in Egypt was more flexible than in other ancient cultures, but it still represented a fundamental change in a woman's status and daily life. Egyptian girls typically married around age 12 or 13, often to men who were significantly older and more established. The marriage ceremony was relatively simple compared to modern standards, but it marked a crucial transition in a woman's life. Unlike in many other cultures, Egyptian women retained their own names after marriage and could inherit property from their parents. The marriage contract, written on papyrus and witnessed by family members, outlined the rights and responsibilities of both partners. The woman would bring a dowry to the marriage, consisting of household goods, jewelry, and sometimes land or slaves. This dowry remained her property throughout the marriage, and she could dispose of it as she saw fit. If the marriage ended in divorce, the woman was entitled to take her dowry with her, providing some financial security. Divorce in ancient Egypt was more common and less stigmatized than in many other ancient societies. Either partner could initiate divorce, though it was still more easily accomplished by men. The grounds for divorce included adultery, infertility, incompatibility, and economic hardship. When a marriage ended, the property had to be divided according to the original marriage contract, and arrangements had to be made for the care of any children. The Egyptian legal system, while still patriarchal, offered women more protection and rights than most ancient cultures. Women could own property, including land, houses, and slaves. They could buy and sell goods, enter into contracts, and even lend money at interest. Egyptian women could also serve as witnesses in legal proceedings and could initiate lawsuits to protect their interests. These rights were not merely theoretical, but were actively used by women throughout Egyptian history. The role of religion in Egyptian women's lives was profound and complex. Many women served as priestesses, particularly in the cult of Hathor, the goddess of love, beauty, and motherhood. These women performed sacred dances, played musical instruments, and participated in religious ceremonies that were essential to maintaining the cosmic order. The position of priestess was one of the few that offered women public recognition and a degree of independence. The title of God's wife was one of the highest religious offices a woman could hold. During the New Kingdom period, 1550–70 BCE, this position became increasingly important politically. The god's wife of Ammon was typically a daughter of the pharaoh who remained celibate and devoted her life to the service of the god. She controlled vast estates, commanded numerous servants, and wielded considerable influence in both religious and political affairs. These religious roles provided women with alternatives to the traditional life of marriage and motherhood. A woman who became a priestess could achieve respect, financial security, and a degree of independence that was impossible for most women. However, these positions were limited in number and typically required family connections or exceptional circumstances to obtain. Childbirth in ancient Egypt was surrounded by ritual, superstition, and very real danger. Women would retreat to special birthing houses, often located on the roofs of homes to be closer to the sky goddesses, who were believed to assist in childbirth. These structures were decorated with images of protective deities and were equipped with birthing bricks on which women would squat during labor. The infant mortality rate in ancient Egypt was devastating. Perhaps as high as 30% of children died before their first birth. Women frequently died in childbirth, and those who survived often faced repeated pregnancies and losses. Medical papyri from the period contain numerous remedies for difficult births, ranging from herbal preparations to magical spells. Many of these remedies involved prayers to Tauret, the hippopotamus goddess who protected women in labor, and to Bez, the dwarf god who warded off evil spirits. The process of childbirth was communal, with female relatives and neighbors assisting the mother. Men were typically excluded from the birth chamber, as childbirth was considered a fundamentally female domain. The women would chant prayers, burn incense, and perform rituals designed to ease the labor and protect both mother and child. If the birth was successful, there would be celebrations and gifts. But if complications arose, the community would rally to provide support and comfort. Egyptian medicine had a sophisticated understanding of women's health issues, though their treatments were often ineffective by modern standards. Medical papyri describe treatments for menstrual problems, fertility issues, and pregnancy complications. Some of these treatments show remarkable insight into female physiology, while others were based on magical thinking and religious belief. The concept of ritual purity was important in Egyptian religion and significantly impacted women's lives. Women were considered temporarily impure during menstruation and childbirth, which barred them from certain religious activities and social interactions. This wasn't necessarily seen as punishment, but rather as a natural part of the cosmic order. However, it did create additional restrictions on women's participation in public life and religious ceremonies. The afterlife beliefs of ancient Egypt provided some comfort to women facing earthly struggles. Unlike many ancient cultures, Egyptian religion promised that women could achieve the same blessed afterlife as men. The Book of the Dead contains spells and instructions for women, as well as men, and tomb paintings show women participating in the same activities in the afterlife that they might have been denied in life: hunting, fishing, and feasting free. The tomb of Nefertari, the wife of Rameses II, provides a spectacular example of how Egyptian women could be honored in death. The walls of her tomb are covered with beautiful paintings showing her journey through the afterlife, her interactions with the gods, and her transformation into a divine being. These images suggest that at least some Egyptian women could look forward to an afterlife of dignity and power, even if their earthly lives were constrained. The wisdom literature of ancient Egypt reveals complex attitudes toward women. The instructions of Ptahhotep, dating to around 200 and 400 BCE, advises men to treat their wives well and provide for them, but it also emphasizes that women should be controlled and guided by male authority. The ideal woman was described as one who was beautiful, fertile, and obedient to her husband's will, but also competent in managing household affairs and raising children. Egyptian love poetry, some of the earliest in world literature, provides insight into the emotional lives of Egyptian women. These poems, written on papyrus and ostraca, express deep romantic feelings and suggest that love and personal choice played some role in Egyptian marriages. The poems speak of longing, jealousy, and devotion in ways that suggest Egyptian women had emotional lives that transcended their social roles. The stories of powerful Egyptian women like Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, and Cleopatra VII have captured modern imagination, but they were exceptional cases. Hatshepsut ruled as pharaoh for over 20 years, adopting male regalia and taking on the full responsibilities of kingship. Nefertiti appears to have wielded unprecedented influence during her husband Akhenaten's reign, and Cleopatra VII was the last pharaoh of Egypt, ruling through intelligence and political skill rather than just birth. However, these exceptional women should not obscure the reality that most Egyptian women lived lives of hard work, limited choices, and constant vulnerability. The vast majority worked in agriculture, domestic service, or crafts, earning barely enough to survive. They faced the constant threat of disease, famine, and social upheaval that characterized life in the ancient world. The end of Egyptian independence with the Roman conquest in 30 BCE brought significant changes to women's lives. Roman law and customs were imposed on Egyptian society, often restricting freedoms that Egyptian women had previously enjoyed. The traditional Egyptian family structure was disrupted, and women found themselves subject to new forms of control and limitation. As we continue our journey through these ancient women's lives, let their stories blend into the peaceful rhythm of your breathing. The Nile that nourished their civilization flows still, carrying with it the memory of countless women who lived, loved, and endured along its bank. Their struggles and their achievements, their sorrows and their joys, become part of the eternal human story that connects us all across the vast expanse of time. Now let us sail across the Mediterranean to the sun-drenched islands and mountainous mainland of ancient Greece, where the concepts of democracy and philosophy flourished like olive trees in the Mediterranean sun, yet where women found themselves more restricted than in many other ancient civilizations. This paradox, that the birthplace of Western ideals of freedom and rational thought systematically excluded half its population from these revolutionary concepts, reveals much about the complex relationship between political progress and social justice. The irony of ancient Greece is profound and troubling. This civilization gave us ideals of freedom, rational thought, and individual dignity that continue to influence our world today. Yet it systematically excluded women from these revolutionary concepts, creating a society where the mothers, wives, and daughters of citizens lived in conditions that would have seemed harsh even to women in other ancient cultures. The very men who debated justice, virtue, and the nature of the good life in the agora kept their own women locked away in the domestic sphere, invisible and voiceless. In Athens, the birthplace of democracy, where citizens gathered in the ecclesia to debate and vote on matters of state, women were legal minors throughout their entire lives. They passed from the authority of their fathers to that of their husbands, and if widowed, to that of their sons or male relatives. They could not vote in the democratic assemblies, own property in their own names, or participate in the political life that defined Athenian civilization and gave it meaning. Yet they were expected to produce and raise the citizens who would enjoy these freedoms, creating a fundamental contradiction at the heart of Greek society. The physical layout of the typical Athenian house reflects the separation between men's and women's worlds. The daily life of an Athenian woman was spent primarily in the gynaikeion, the women's quarters of the house. This was typically located on the upper floor, away from the public areas where men conducted business and entertained guests. The gynaikeion was reached by a separate staircase and was designed to be completely separate from the men's areas of the house. Here, in these upstairs rooms, women would spend their days spinning wool, weaving cloth, and supervising household slaves. The production of textiles was not merely domestic work, but a source of pride and economic value that contributed significantly to the household's wealth and status. A woman's skill with the loom was considered one of her most important attributes, and the quality of cloth she produced was seen as a reflection of her character and virtue. The process of creating cloth was laborious and time-consuming. Women would begin by cleaning and carding raw wool, removing impurities and aligning the fibers. Then they would spin the wool into thread using a distaff and spindle, a skill that required years to master. The thread had to be even and strong, as weak thread would break during weaving and ruin the fabric. Once the thread was prepared, it would be woven on a large loom that dominated the women's quarter. The patterns and designs that Greek women wove into their cloth were often complex and beautiful, incorporating geometric designs, floral motifs, and sometimes narrative scenes. These designs were passed down from mothers to daughters, creating a rich tradition of textile art that was exclusively female. The clothing produced in these domestic workshops was not only for the family's use, but was also traded or sold, providing important income for the house. Consider the life of Aspasia, one of the few women from ancient Greece whose name and story have survived in historical records. She was a foreigner, a metic from Miletus, who became the companion of Pericles, the great Athenian statesman who led the city during its golden age in the 5th century. Because she was not an Athenian citizen, she had slightly more freedom than citizen women, but she also faced unique challenges and prejudices. Aspasia was educated, intelligent, and skilled in rhetoric, qualities that were prized in men but viewed with suspicion in women. She was known to host gatherings where philosophers, politicians, and intellectuals would come to discuss ideas and current events. Some sources suggest that she may have helped Pericles write his speeches, including the famous funeral oration that honored the Athenian dead in the Peloponnesian War. However, Aspasia's influence and intelligence made her a target for criticism, and the comic playwright Aristophanes mocked her in his plays, and political opponents of Pericles used her foreign birth and unconventional lifestyle to attack him. She was prosecuted for impiety, a serious charge that could have resulted in exile or death, and only Pericles' intervention saved her. Her story demonstrates both the possibilities and the dangers faced by women who attempted to transcend traditional boundaries. The marriage customs of ancient Greece reveal much about women's status and the expectations placed upon them. Girls were typically married around age 14 to men in their 20s or 30s, often to men they had never met before. The wedding ceremony. The marriage was arranged by the fathers of the bride and groom, with the girl having no say in the choice of her husband. The marriage was fundamentally a contract between two families, designed to create alliances and ensure the continuation of the male line. The wedding ceremony included several rituals that emphasized the transfer of the bride from her father's authority to her husband. The bride would be ceremonially captured by the groom and his friends, reflecting the ancient practice of marriage by abduction. She would be taken from her father's house to her husband's house in a procession that marked her transition from maiden to wife. The ceremony concluded with the couple being locked in the bridal chamber, symbolically consummating the marriage and completing the transfer of the woman from one man to another. The bride's dowry was an essential part of the marriage arrangement. This consisted of money, goods, and sometimes land that the bride's father provided to help establish the new household. The dowry remained the property of the wife in theory, but it was managed by her husband and could not be disposed of without his consent. If the marriage ended in divorce or the husband's death, the dowry was supposed to be returned to the wife or her family, providing her with some financial security. Education for women in Athens was minimal and focused entirely on domestic skills. While boys attended schools where they learned reading, writing, mathematics, music, and rhetoric, girls learned household management, weaving, and basic literacy at home from their mothers or female slaves. The assumption was that women's minds were not suited for the intellectual pursuits that occupied men, and that education would only make them dissatisfied with their proper roles. The philosopher Plato, in his Republic, imagined a society where women could receive the same education as men, and could even serve as guardians of the state. However, this was considered so radical that it was relegated to his fictional ideal state, and even Plato's own students found the idea difficult to accept. Aristotle, Plato's greatest student, argued that women were naturally inferior to men, and that their subjugation was both natural and beneficial. The religious life of Greek women provided their primary opportunity for public participation and social interaction. Festivals like the Thesmophoria, dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, were exclusively for women. During these festivals, which could last for several days, women would leave their homes, camp together in temporary shelters, and participate in rituals that celebrated fertility and the agricultural cycle. These events were among the few times when women could gather publicly without male supervision and could express themselves freely. The Thesmophoria was celebrated throughout the Greek world and was one of the most important religious festivals. Women would fast, perform secret rituals, and make offerings to ensure good harvests and fertility. The festival created a temporary world where women could speak freely, make decisions collectively, and experience a sense of community and autonomy that was denied to them in daily life. Men were strictly excluded from these celebrations, and the penalties for male intrusion were severe. Other religious festivals also provided opportunities for women's participation. The Panathenaea, Athens' most important festival, included a procession where women of all ages would carry offerings to the goddess Athena. Young girls served as a referoi, helping to weave the sacred peplos that was presented to the goddess. These roles were considered great honors and provided some of the few opportunities for women to gain public recognition and respect. The story of Penelope, Odysseus's wife in Homer's Odyssey, became the ideal of Greek womanhood that all women were expected to emulate. She waited faithfully for 20 years while her husband wandered the Mediterranean, fending off suitors who wanted to marry her and claim Odysseus's throne. During this time, she maintained the household, raised their son Telemachus, and cleverly delayed the suitors by promising to choose one of them when she finished weaving a shroud for Odysseus's father Laertes. Penelope's famous trick was to weave during the day and secretly unravel her work at night, ensuring that the shroud was never completed. This deception allowed her to maintain her loyalty to Odysseus, while protecting herself and her household from the increasingly aggressive suitors. When Homer's audience heard this story, they understood that Penelope represented the perfect balance of loyalty, cleverness, and domestic skill that defined the ideal woman. Yet even this paragon of virtue was criticized by some ancient writers for being too clever and independent in her methods of resistance. The tension in Greek attitudes toward women is evident in their simultaneous admiration for Penelope's loyalty and their discomfort with her intelligence and agency. Women were expected to be virtuous and devoted, but not too clever or independent in their virtue. Greek medicine and philosophy developed complex theories about women's biology that provided pseudo-scientific justification for their exclusion from public life. The physician Hippocrates and his followers believed that women's bodies were fundamentally different from men's, not just in obvious ways, but in their entire constitution. They thought women were naturally colder and wetter than men, which made them more emotional, less rational, and unsuited for the rigorous thinking required for politics and philosophy. These medical theories suggested that women's reproductive functions dominated their entire beings, making them unstable and unreliable. Menstruation was seen as evidence of women's inherent imbalance, and pregnancy and childbirth were viewed as natural processes that consumed women's physical and mental energy. The Greek medical tradition argued that women's bodies were designed primarily for reproduction, and that any attempt to engage them in intellectual or political activities would be harmful to both their health and their essential function. The philosopher Aristotle systematized these ideas in his biological and political writings. He argued that women were essentially incomplete men, lacking the heat and vital force that made men fully human. In his view, women contributed only the material substance for reproduction, while men provided the form and soul that made the resulting offspring truly human. This biological theory supported his political argument that women's natural inferiority made their subordination not only acceptable but necessary for the good of society. The tragic plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides often featured strong female characters who challenged these assumptions about women's nature and proper roles. Characters like Antigone, who defied King Creon's authority to bury her brother according to divine law, or Medea, who took terrible revenge on her unfaithful husband Jason, represented the power that women might possess if freed from social constraint. These dramatic characters were simultaneously admired and feared by Greek audiences. Antigone's willingness to die for her principles was seen as heroic, but her defiance of male authority was also deeply troubling. Medea's intelligence and magical powers made her a formidable opponent, but her use of these abilities to murder her own children horrified audiences and reinforced stereotypes about women's dangerous emotionality. The fact that these female characters were performed by male actors in masks and costumes added another layer of complexity to their reception. Greek audiences were watching men portray women, which may have made it easier for them to appreciate the dramatic power of these characters, while maintaining their belief that real women should not possess such strength or independence. The hetairai, educated courtesans who served as companions to wealthy men, occupied a unique and complicated position in Greek society. Unlike citizen wives who were expected to be modest, invisible and focused entirely on domestic duties, hetairai were trained in music, dance, conversation, and sometimes philosophy. They could attend symposiums, engage in intellectual discussions, and accumulate wealth and property. Some hetairai became famous for their beauty, intelligence, and influence. Phryne, who lived in the 4th century BCE, was said to be so beautiful that she served as a model for several famous sculptures, including Praxiteles' Aphrodite of Cnido. When she was prosecuted for impiety, her defender reportedly had her disrobe in court, arguing that such beauty could not be impious since it was clearly favored by the gods. However, hetairai were also social outcasts, excluded from the respectability that marriage brought, and vulnerable to social and legal persecution. They could not marry citizens or have legitimate children, and their relationships with men were always precarious. Their education and independence came at the cost of social acceptance and security, making them both freer and more vulnerable than married women. The institution of pederasty in ancient Greece, the socially accepted practice of older men forming educational and often sexual relationships with adolescent boys, further marginalized women by creating an alternative model of male companionship and intellectual development. Greek men often found their most meaningful emotional and intellectual relationships with other men, viewing women as necessary for reproduction, but incapable of true friendship or intellectual partnership. In Sparta, women's lives were dramatically different from those in Athens, reflecting the unique values and needs of Spartan society. Spartan women were expected to be physically strong and healthy to bear strong warriors for the state. They exercised regularly, competed in athletic contests, and had more freedom of movement than Athenian women. They could own property, and they were expected to manage their households and estates, while their husbands were away at war. However, this freedom came at a significant cost. Spartan women's lives were still defined primarily by their reproductive function, and they were expected to sacrifice their sons to the state without complaint. The famous story of the Spartan mother who told her son to come back with your shield or on it reflects the expectation that women should value military honor above their own maternal feelings. Spartan women were also expected to encourage competition in excellence in men, sometimes through harsh criticism and mockery. They were said to ridicule cowardly men and to refuse to marry or associate with those who had shown cowardice in battle. This role as judges of male virtue gave Spartan women a kind of power, but it was power exercised in service of male-dominated military values. The mystery religions of ancient Greece offered women alternative spiritual experiences that were often more egalitarian than traditional Greek religion. The Eleusinian mysteries, which promised initiates a blessed afterlife, were open to both men and women, free and slave. The goddess Demeter, who searched for her daughter Persephone in the underworld, represented the fierce love of mothers and the cycle of death and rebirth that governed both agricultural and human life. These mystery religions provided women with opportunities for spiritual fulfillment that were denied to them in other areas of life. The initiation ceremonies were secret and exclusive, creating communities of shared experience that transcended normal social boundaries. Women could participate as equals in these religious experiences, and some even served as priestesses and leaders in the mystery cult. The cult of Dionysus was particularly appealing to women, as it offered temporary escape from the constraints of daily life through ecstatic dancing, wine consumption, and religious frenzy. The annual festivals of Dionysus allowed women to leave their homes and participate in wild celebrations that inverted normal social hierarchies. These festivals were both liberating and dangerous, as they challenged the fundamental assumptions about women's nature and proper behavior. The economic contributions of women to Greek society were significant, but largely invisible and unrecognized. Women's textile production was essential to the household economy, and their management of domestic affairs freed men to participate in politics and warfare. Slave women performed much of the hard labor that made Greek civilization possible, working in households, shops, and workshops throughout the Greek world. The institution of slavery was fundamental to Greek society, and female slaves faced particularly harsh conditions. They could be bought, sold, and used for any purpose their owners saw fit, including sexual services. The children of slave women belonged to their owners, and slave mothers had no rights to their own offspring. Some slave women were able to earn their freedom through loyal service or by saving money, but most remained in bondage throughout their lives. The philosophical schools of ancient Greece developed elaborate theories about women's nature and proper roles that influenced Western thought for centuries. While some philosophers like Plato occasionally suggested that women might be capable of more than traditional roles allowed, the dominant philosophical tradition reinforced women's subordination through arguments about their inherent inferiority. The Stoic philosophers, who emphasized reason and virtue as the highest human goals, theoretically believed that women could achieve wisdom and virtue like men. However, they also argued that women's social roles were determined by nature, and that their primary duty was to support men in their pursuit of wisdom and virtue. This created a philosophical system that spoke of universal human dignity, while practically excluding women from full participation in the philosophical life. The legacy of ancient Greek attitudes toward women was profound and long-lasting. The Greek idealization of male beauty, intelligence, and virtue, combined with the systematic exclusion of women from public life, created patterns of thinking that influenced Western civilization for millennia. The tension between Greek ideals of freedom and dignity and their treatment of women reveals the complex and often contradictory nature of human social development. As we explore these ancient Greek women's lives, let their struggles and their limited victories carry you deeper into peaceful sleep. The marble columns of their temples may have crumbled, but the human stories they witnessed continue to resonate through the centuries, reminding us of the enduring quest for dignity and freedom that transcends the boundaries of time and place. Our final destination on this journey through ancient women's lives brings us to Rome, the eternal city that would grow from a small Italian settlement on the Tiber River to rule the Mediterranean world and beyond. Here, women's lives evolved dramatically over the centuries, reflecting the changing nature of Roman society as it transformed from a small republic of citizen farmers to a vast empire that encompassed dozens of cultures and people. Roman women occupied a unique position in the ancient world, one that was more complex and contradictory than perhaps any other ancient civilization. Unlike their Greek counterparts, Roman women could appear in public, attend social gatherings, and participate in business transactions. They could own property, inherit wealth, and exercise considerable influence within their families and social circles. Yet they remained under the legal authority of male relatives throughout their lives, and their primary value was still fundamentally defined by their role as mothers of future citizens and preservers of family honor. The evolution of Roman women's status paralleled the growth of Roman power and wealth. In the early Republic, when Rome was a small city-state of farmers and soldiers, women's lives were severely restricted and closely regulated. As Rome conquered the Mediterranean and wealth flowed into the city, women's opportunities expanded, but so did the anxieties about their growing independence. The tension between women's increasing freedom and traditional expectations created ongoing conflicts that shaped Roman law, literature, and social customs. The ideal Roman woman was the matrona, the married woman who managed her household with dignity and efficiency, while maintaining the moral standards that were believed to be essential to Roman success. She was expected to be modest in dress and behavior, fertile and devoted to her children, loyal to her husband, and skilled in the domestic arts that kept the household running smoothly. The matrona was a public figure in ways that Greek women were not, but her public role was always defined by her private relationships and domestic responsibilities. The concept of the matrona was deeply embedded in Roman mythology and historical consciousness. Romans told stories of legendary women like Lucretia, whose suicide after being raped by a king's son supposedly sparked a revolution that established the Republic. They celebrated Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi brothers, who famously declared, that her sons were her jewels when shown another woman's precious stone. These exemplary figures provided models of female virtue that real women were expected to emulate, though the standards they set were often impossibly high. The Matrona's appearance was carefully regulated by both law and custom. The stola, a long dress that covered the body from neck to ankles, was the distinctive garment of married women and marked their status as respectable matrons. The wearing of the stola was a privilege that could be revoked for moral failings, and women who had been convicted of adultery were forbidden to wear it. The pulla, a rectangular cloak worn over the stola, provided additional covering and dignity when women appeared in public. Let us imagine the life of Claudia, a fictional but representative Roman woman of the late Republic, born around 80 BCE into a senatorial family. Her father, a successful politician and military commander, would have arranged her education to prepare her for marriage to a man of similar social standing. Unlike Greek girls, Claudia would have received a formal education that included reading, writing, basic mathematics, and perhaps even some Greek literature and philosophy. Claudia's education would have taken place at home under the supervision of a Greek slave or freedman who served as her tutor. She would have learned to read and write in both Latin and Greek, to calculate household expenses, and to appreciate poetry and literature. However, her education would have been carefully limited to subjects that were considered appropriate for women. She would not have studied rhetoric, which was essential for political life, or advanced mathematics and philosophy, which were considered too abstract and demanding for the female mind. The educational curriculum for upper-class Roman girls was more extensive than that available to girls in most other ancient societies. They studied the works of Homer, Virgil, and Ovid, learning to appreciate poetry and literature that would make them cultured conversation partners for their husbands. They studied history, particularly the glorious achievements of Rome and the exemplary behavior of virtuous women from the past. Music and dancing were considered essential accomplishments, as were the skills needed to manage a household and supervise servants. Physical education was also part of a Roman girl's upbringing, though it was quite different from the athletic training that boys received. Girls learned graceful movement and proper posture, skills that would serve them well in their public appearances as matrons. They might learn to swim, as this was considered a practical skill, and they were encouraged to take walks and engage in other gentle forms of exercise that would maintain their health without compromising their modesty. The religious education of Roman girls was particularly important, as they would later be responsible for maintaining their household's religious observance. They learned the proper rituals for honoring the household gods, the calendar of religious festivals, and the stories of the gods and goddesses who protected Rome. They were taught to weave and embroider, skills that had religious as well as practical significance, as the creation of textiles was associated with feminine virtue and divine favor. At age 15, Claudia would have been married to Marcus, a young man from another senatorial family, chosen by her father to strengthen political alliances. The marriage would have been celebrated with elaborate ceremonies that lasted several days and involved the entire extended family. The wedding ritual included the joining of hands, the sharing of cake, and the bride's ceremonial transfer from her father's house to her husband's house, where she would take on the responsibilities of managing a large and complex household. The Roman wedding ceremony was rich in symbolism and ancient tradition. The bride wore a special white tunic called a tunica recta, woven on an ancient type of loom, and her hair was arranged in an elaborate style, using a spear to part it, symbolizing the conquest of the bride. The ceremony began with the taking of auspices to ensure the gods' approval, followed by the signing of the marriage contract in the presence of 10 witnesses. The bride and groom joined hands and exchanged vows, after which they shared a cake made of spelt, an ancient grain that connected them to Rome's agricultural origins. The Roman household was far more than a nuclear family. It typically included not just parents and children, but also slaves, freedmen, clients, and extended relatives, who might live in the house or near. Claudia would have been responsible for managing this complex community, overseeing the work of dozens of slaves, maintaining the family's religious observances, and ensuring that the household operated efficiently and harmoniously. The physical layout of the Roman house reflected the complex social relationships within it. The atrium, the central hall of the house, was where the family received clients and conducted business. The tablinum, the master's study, was where important documents were kept and where the family's imagined wax masks of deceased ancestors were displayed. The peristyle, a garden surrounded by columns, provided a private space for the family, while the various cubicula, or bedrooms, housed family members, guests, and favoured slaves. The management of such a household required considerable administrative skill. Claudia would have needed to keep detailed records of expenses, coordinate the work of specialized slaves, and ensure that the household's various economic activities operated smoothly. She would have supervised the kitchen slaves who prepared elaborate meals for the family and their guests, the cleaning slaves who maintained the house, and the personal slaves who attended to the family's clothing and grooming needs. The daily routine of managing a wealthy Roman household was demanding and required considerable skill and intelligence. Claudia would have risen before dawn to begin her day, first attending to her personal grooming and dress, which was itself a time-consuming process. Roman women of the upper classes wore elaborate clothing that required assistance to put on properly, and their hair was styled in complex arrangements that took hours to achieve and maintain. After dressing, Claudia would have begun her supervision of the household's daily activity. She would have met with the villicus, the slave who managed the household's affairs, to discuss the day's plans and address any problems that had arisen. She would have reviewed the accounts, checked the stores of food and supplies, and made decisions about purchases and expenditure. The household's economic activities were substantial, involving not just daily consumption, but also the management of urban and rural properties that provided the family's income. The morning hours were typically devoted to administrative tasks and household management. Claudia would have received reports from various slave supervisors about the condition of the house, the progress of ongoing projects, and any disciplinary issues that needed attention. She would have made decisions about menu planning, ensuring that the household's meals were appropriate to the family's status and the requirements of any guests who might be entertained. The supervision of household slaves required considerable skill in human relations. Claudia would have needed to balance firmness with fairness, maintaining discipline, while avoiding the kind of harsh treatment that might provoke rebellion or inefficiency. She would have been responsible for the health and welfare of dozens of people, ensuring that they received adequate food, clothing, and medical care. The most skilled and trusted slaves might be rewarded with better living conditions or the possibility of eventual freedom. One of Claudia's most important responsibilities would have been the supervision of textile production. Even wealthy Roman households produced much of their own clothing, and the quality of the family's garments was seen as a reflection of the matrona's skill and diligence. Claudia would have overseen slave women who spun thread, wove cloth, and sewed garments for the entire household. She would have been expected to be skilled in these arts herself, and to be able to teach and supervise others. The production of textiles was not merely a practical necessity, but also a moral and religious activity. The spinning and weaving of wool was associated with feminine virtue and divine favor, and the finest Roman women were expected to be skilled in these arts. The Empress Livia was famous for weaving cloth for her husband Augustus, and this domestic skill was celebrated as evidence of her virtue and devotion to traditional Roman values. Claudia would have been responsible for maintaining the household's religious observances, which included daily offerings to the Lares and Penates, the gods who protected the home and family. She would have participated in numerous public festivals throughout the year, some of which were exclusively for women. These religious duties were not merely ritual obligations, but were believed to be essential to the family's prosperity and the state's security. The household shrine, or lararium, was typically located in the atrium and contained images of the family's protective deities. Claudia would have made daily offerings of food, wine, and incense to these gods, prayers that were believed to ensure the family's safety and prosperity. She would have supervised the preparation of special foods for religious festivals and ensured that all family members and slaves observed the proper rituals. The religious calendar was filled with festivals that required the participation of Roman women. The Matronalia, celebrated on March 1st, honored Juno as the protector of married women and was marked by wives receiving gifts from their husbands and prayers for marital harmony. The Vestalia, celebrated in June, honored the goddess Vesta and required matrons to walk barefoot to her temple to make offerings. The Bona Dea festival, held in December, was exclusively for women and was shrouded in such secrecy that men were not even allowed to know the details of the ritual. Women's religious activities sometimes provided opportunities for social interaction and even political influence that were denied to them in other contexts. Religious festivals brought together women from different social classes and allowed them to form networks of friendship and mutual support. The most prominent matrons might sponsor public festivals or dedicate temples, activities that brought them public recognition and enhanced their family's prestige. The mystery religions that became popular during the imperial period offered women new forms of spiritual experience and religious authority. The cult of Isis, imported from Egypt, was particularly appealing to Roman women because it offered them active roles in religious ceremonies and promised personal salvation. The goddess Isis was portrayed as a loving mother and powerful protector who could intervene in human affairs to help her devotees. The cult's emphasis on personal devotion and emotional expression appealed to women who found traditional Roman religion too formal and distant. The relationship between Roman women and their children was complex and emotionally demanding. While Roman mothers were expected to be devoted to their children, they often had limited direct involvement in their daily care. Wealthy Roman children were raised by slave nurses and tutors, and their mothers maintained more formal relationships with them. However, mothers were held responsible for their children's moral development and were expected to instill in them the values and behaviors that would make them good Roman citizens. The high infant mortality rate meant that Roman women experienced repeated pregnancies and frequent loss. It was not uncommon for women to bear 8 or 10 children and to see half of them die in infancy or childhood. The emotional toll of these losses was enormous, but women were expected to bear their grief with dignity and to continue their reproductive duties despite their sorrow. The pressure to produce male heirs was particularly intense, as daughters could not carry on the family name or inherit the father's political position. The process of childbirth was dangerous and frightening for Roman women. Medical knowledge was limited, and many women died in childbirth or from complications that arose after. The goddess Juno Lucina was invoked to protect women during labor, and various rituals and amulets were used to ensure safe delivery. Skilled midwives attended births, but their knowledge was based largely on experience and traditional practices, rather than scientific understanding. Roman mothers were expected to nurse their own children, though wealthy women often employed wet nurses to perform this function. The use of wet nurses was controversial, as some moralists argued that mothers who did not nurse their own children were shirking their natural duty. However, the practice was common among the upper classes, particularly when frequent pregnancies made it difficult for mothers to nurse for extended periods. The early years of childhood were considered the mother's responsibility, and women were expected to oversee their children's moral and intellectual development. They taught their children to speak properly, to behave respectfully toward their elders, and to understand their place in the complex social hierarchy of Roman society. Mothers were also responsible for their daughters' education in domestic skills and for preparing them for their future roles as wives and mothers. Roman law provided women with more rights than most ancient legal systems, but these rights were always limited by the concept of male guardianship. Roman women could own property, but they needed the approval of their male guardians to buy, sell, or dispose of significant assets. They could inherit wealth from their fathers and husbands, but they could not make wills without permission. They could initiate legal proceedings, but they could not serve as judges or lawyers. The concept of patria potestas, the absolute authority of the father over his family, was fundamental to Roman law and society. This authority extended to adult daughters as well as sons, and it meant that fathers could theoretically control their daughters' marriages, divorces, and property throughout their lives. However, social custom and practical considerations often limited the exercise of this authority, and many Roman women enjoyed considerable independence in their daily lives. The legal position of Roman women varied significantly, depending on the type of marriage they entered. In the older form of marriage called cum manu, the wife passed from her father's authority to her husband's and became legally equivalent to his daughter. In the newer form called sine manu, the wife remained under her father's authority and retained the right to inherit from her birth family. This form of marriage became increasingly common during the late Republic and Empire, as it provided women with greater economic independence. The system of guardianship, or tutela, was designed to protect women's property interests, while maintaining male control over their legal activity. Women were assigned guardians, usually male relatives, who were required to approve major financial transactions. However, the system was often more theoretical than practical, and many women found ways to circumvent these restrictions. Some women chose compliant guardians who would approve their decisions, while others used legal loopholes to conduct business independently. Roman women could own slaves, real estate, and other forms of property, and they could engage in business activities, either directly or through agents. Some women became quite wealthy through inheritance, investment, or business ventures. However, their economic activities were always constrained by social expectations about appropriate female behavior and by legal restrictions that required male approval for major transactions. Divorce in Roman society was relatively common and could be initiated by either spouse, though it was more easily accomplished by men. The grounds for divorce included adultery, infertility, incompatibility, and political necessity. When marriages ended, the property had to be divided according to complex legal rules, and arrangements had to be made for the care of children, who typically remained with their fathers. Divorced women were expected to remarry quickly, both for their own security and to fulfill their reproductive obligations to society. The Emperor Augustus, concerned about declining birth rates among the upper classes and the perceived moral decay of Roman society, passed a series of laws designed to encourage marriage and childbearing. The Lex Julia de Adulteriis made adultery a public crime punishable by exile, while the Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus required widows and divorced women to remarry within specified time limits. These Augustan laws created new opportunities for women to gain independence from male guardianship. Women who had 3 or more children were granted the ius trium liberorum, which freed them from the need for guardian approval in most legal matters. However, the laws also created new forms of control and surveillance, as the state now took an active interest in regulating women's private lives and reproductive choices. The Augustan legislation reflected the emperor's belief that moral reform was essential to Rome's continued success and stability. The laws were designed to restore traditional family values and to encourage the upper classes to have more children. However, they also revealed the extent to which Roman society had changed, and the degree to which traditional gender roles had been challenged by the economic and social transformations of the late Republic. The impact of these laws on women's daily lives was significant and often contradictory. While some women gained greater legal independence through the ius trium liberorum, others found their choices more restricted by requirements to remarry and by increased surveillance of their sexual behavior. The laws also created new categories of social status, as freeborn women were subject to different requirements than freed women, and the children of citizens were treated differently from those of non-citizens. The imperial period saw the emergence of powerful women who wielded considerable influence behind the scenes. Livia, Augustus's wife, was known for her political intelligence and her ability to influence imperial policy. Julia Domna, the wife of Emperor Septimius Severus, was a patron of philosophers and writers who held court in her own right. These women operated within the constraints of traditional gender roles, but they found ways to exercise power and influence that would have been impossible in earlier periods. Livia's influence was particularly significant because she helped establish the model for future imperial women. She was careful to maintain the appearance of traditional feminine virtue while exercising considerable political power behind the scenes. She was known for her intelligence, her political acumen, and her ability to navigate the complex world of imperial politics. Her house became a center of political activity, and she was consulted on important matters of state. The empresses of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, including Messalina and Agrippina the Younger, were notorious for their political ambitions and their willingness to use violence to achieve their goals. These women were portrayed by male historians as examples of the corruption and moral decay that resulted from giving women too much power. However, their stories also revealed the limited options available to women who sought influence political events and the dangerous nature of imperial politics. The Flavian and Antonine dynasties produced a series of empresses who were known for their virtue and their devotion to traditional Roman values. Women like Domitia Longina and Faustina the Elder were celebrated for their moral character and their support of their husbands' policies. These women exercised influence through their roles as wives and mothers, rather than through direct political activity, but they were still important figures in the imperial court. The 3rd century crisis brought new challenges and opportunities for imperial women. Julia Domna and her sister Julia Maesa were instrumental in the rise of the Severan dynasty, and they used their political skills to maintain stability during a period of great turmoil. These women were highly educated and culturally sophisticated, and they patronized philosophers, writers, and artists who contributed to the intellectual life of the empire. However, the growing power and visibility of some Roman women also created backlash and criticism. Male writers like Juvenal and Martial wrote satirical works that mocked women's increasing independence and education. They complained that women were abandoning their traditional roles, neglecting their households, and attempting to compete with men in areas where they had no business. These criticisms reflected male anxieties about changing gender roles and the perceived threat that women's liberation posed to traditional Roman values. Juvenal's 6th satire, devoted entirely to criticizing women, provides a particularly vivid example of male anxiety about women's changing roles. He mocked women who studied philosophy, practiced athletics, and engaged in legal disputes, arguing that such activities were inappropriate for their sex. He complained that women were becoming too independent and were no longer content to fulfill their traditional roles as wives and mothers. The satirical literature of the imperial period reflects broader social tensions about women's roles and the appropriate limits of female behavior. These works were popular with male audiences who were uncomfortable with the changes they observed in women's lives and who longed for a return to what they imagined were simpler, more traditional. However, the very existence of such criticism suggests that women's lives were indeed changing and that they were finding new opportunities for self-expression and independence. The moral philosophers of the imperial period also grappled with questions about women's roles and capability. Stoic philosophers like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius generally supported traditional gender roles, but acknowledged that women were capable of virtue and philosophical understanding. Some philosophers, like Musonius Rufus, argued that women should receive the same education as men, and that they were capable of the same intellectual achievement. The elaborate hairstyles of imperial women, which required hours of work by skilled slave hairdressers, were seen as symbols of luxury and refinement, but also as evidence of moral corruption. The use of cosmetics, jewelry, and expensive fabrics was simultaneously expected and condemned, reflecting the complex attitudes toward women's roles in society. The process of creating these elaborate hairstyles was time-consuming and required considerable skill. Slave women called arnatrices specialized in hairdressing and would spend hours each morning arranging their mistress's hair in the complex styles that were fashionable at court. These styles changed frequently, and women were expected to keep up with the latest trend. The failure to maintain an appropriate appearance was seen as a sign of moral laxity or economic decline. The development of Roman women's fashion was influenced by contact with other cultures throughout the empire. Silk from China, pearls from the Persian Gulf, and precious stones from India became essential elements of upper-class women's wardrobes. The importation of these luxury goods contributed to the empire's economic growth, but also created moral concerns about the corrupting influence of foreign luxuries. The regulation of women's appearance was a constant concern for Roman moralists and lawmakers. Sumptuary laws were passed to limit spending on clothing and jewelry, but these laws were difficult to enforce and were often ignored. The tension between the desire to display wealth and status and the moral imperative to maintain traditional simplicity was a recurring theme in Roman discussions of women's behavior. The use of cosmetics was particularly controversial. Roman women used a variety of preparations to enhance their appearance, including face paints, eye makeup, and hair dyes. These cosmetics were often dangerous as they contained lead and other toxic substances. The use of makeup was criticized by moralists who argued that it was deceptive and that women should be content with their natural appearance. They could attend the theatre, the races, and public festivals, but they were expected to behave with modesty and dignity. They could engage in business transactions and legal proceedings, but they were excluded from political office and military service. They could own property and accumulate wealth, but they were expected to use their resources to support their families and enhance their husbands' career. The lives of Roman women varied dramatically by social class, and the experiences of aristocratic women like our fictional Claudia were vastly different from those of the poor, slave women, or those who lived in the province. Slave women faced lives of hardship and exploitation, with no legal rights and no protection from abuse. They could be forced into prostitution, used as wet nurses for other women's children, or assigned to back-breaking labor in mines, farms, and workshops. Female slaves who worked in wealthy households might have better living conditions and opportunities for advancement, but they remained vulnerable to sexual exploitation and arbitrary punishment. Some slave women were able to earn their freedom through loyal service or by saving money, but freedom brought its own challenges. Freed women remained tied to their former masters' families through bonds of obligation and dependence that lasted throughout their lives. The wives of soldiers, merchants, and craftsmen faced different challenges from those of the senatorial elite. They were more likely to work outside the home, to have closer relationships with their children, and to have fewer resources to cushion them against economic hardship. However, they also had more freedom of movement and fewer social constraints than their upper-class counterparts. Rural women, who made up the majority of the female population, lived lives that were largely invisible to the urban writers who have left us most of our sources. They worked in agriculture, raised animals, and managed households that were largely self-sufficient. They were more likely to marry within their own social class and to have marriages based on economic partnership rather than political alliance. The women of the provinces faced the additional challenge of adapting to Roman culture while maintaining their own traditions. Some embraced Roman customs and succeeded in Roman society, while others maintained their traditional ways of life. The process of Romanization affected women differently depending on their social class, their geographic location, and their family circumstance. The religious life of Roman women was rich and varied, providing opportunities for public participation and spiritual fulfillment that were denied to them in other areas of life. The Vestal Virgins, priestesses of the goddess Vesta, were among the most honored women in Rome. They enjoyed privileges denied to other women, including the right to own property, make wills, and move freely through the city. However, they also faced death if they broke their vows of chastity, and their lives were entirely devoted to maintaining the sacred fire that was believed to protect Rome. The selection of Vestal Virgins was a complex process that involved the entire Roman elite. Girls between the ages of 6 and 10 were chosen from patrician families to serve for 30 years. During their service, they were required to remain celibate and to devote themselves entirely to their religious duties. After 30 years, they were free to marry and leave the temple, but few chose to do so, as they had become accustomed to their independence and honored status. The Vestal Virgins lived in a complex near the Forum and were supported by the state. They were responsible for maintaining the sacred fire of Vesta, which was believed to protect Rome from destruction. They also prepared the ritual foods used in religious ceremonies and served as guardians of important documents and wills. Their position was so sacred that they could intervene to save condemned prisoners, and that their testimony was accepted in court without the need for oath-taking. Roman women's participation in mystery religions and foreign cults sometimes brought them into conflict with traditional Roman values and government authorities. The Senate's suppression of the Bacchanalian rites in 1806 BCE was partly motivated by fear of women's independent religious activities and their potential for political subversion. Later, the growth of Christianity would offer women new roles and opportunities, while also reinforcing traditional gender hierarchies. The mystery religions offered women more personal and emotional forms of religious experience than traditional Roman religion. The cult of Demeter and Persephone, imported from Greece, appealed to women because it dealt with themes of motherhood, death, and rebirth that were central to their life experience. The cult of Cybele, the Great Mother, allowed women to participate in ecstatic rituals that were forbidden in traditional Roman religion. The growth of Christianity in the imperial period created new opportunities for women's religious participation. Christian women could join religious communities, devote themselves to charitable work, and achieve recognition as martyrs and saints. However, Christianity also reinforced traditional gender hierarchies and created new forms of control over women's sexuality and reproductive choice. The letters of Pliny the Younger provide valuable glimpses into the lives of educated Roman women in the early imperial period. His correspondence with his wife Calpurnia reveals a relationship based on mutual affection and intellectual companionship. Pliny describes how Calpurnia would memorize his works, set them to music, and attend his public readings. Their relationship suggests that at least some Roman marriages involved genuine partnership and shared interests. However, even these privileged women were expected to subordinate their interests to their husbands' careers and their families' needs. Calpurnia's literary activities were valued primarily because they supported Pliny's work, and her identity was defined by her relationship to him, rather than by her own achievements. The letters reveal both the possibilities and the limitations of women's lives in the Roman elite. Some Roman women achieved recognition as writers and intellectuals in their own right. Sulpicia, a poet of the Augustan period, wrote elegies that survive today and provide a rare female voice in Latin literature. Her poems deal with themes of love and desire from a woman's perspective, and suggest that at least some Roman women were able to express themselves creatively and intellectually. The Empress Julia Domna was famous for her intellectual salon, which attracted philosophers, writers, and scholars from throughout the empire. She was a patron of learning and supported the work of historians like Dio Cassius and philosophers like Philostratus. Her cultural activities helped to maintain Roman intellectual life during a period of political instability, and demonstrated the important role that women could play in supporting scholarship and the art. The development of Roman law was influenced by women's legal activities and their need for legal protection. The jurists who created the sophisticated legal system of the imperial period had to address questions about women's property rights, marriage and divorce, and guardianship. Their legal writings reveal the complex ways in which Roman society attempted to balance women's need for legal protection with traditional beliefs about male authority. The expansion of the Roman Empire brought contact with different cultural attitudes toward women from across the Mediterranean world and beyond. The Celtic women of Britain and Gaul, the Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine, and the various peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean all had different customs regarding women's roles and rights. The Roman historian Tacitus noted with surprise that Germanic women were consulted on important matters and were believed to have prophetic powers that men lacked. These encounters with different cultures sometimes influenced Roman attitudes toward women, but they also reinforced Roman beliefs about their own superiority and the correctness of their social arrangement. Roman writers often portrayed foreign women as either more savage and uncontrolled than Roman women, or as more subservient and oppressed. These comparisons were used to justify Roman imperial expansion and to reinforce traditional Roman gender roles. The process of cultural exchange was complex and worked in both directions. Roman women who lived in the provinces often adopted local customs and practices, while provincial women who moved to Rome brought their own traditions with them. The result was a gradual blending of cultures that created new forms of gender relations and social organization. The Roman army's movement throughout the empire created opportunities for cultural exchange through the marriages of soldiers to local women. These marriages often combined Roman legal practices with local customs and created new forms of family organization. The children of these marriages were raised with knowledge of both Roman and local cultures, and often served as intermediaries between different cultural groups. Trade networks throughout the empire also facilitated cultural exchange. Roman women's fashion was influenced by textiles and jewelry from India, China, and other distant lands. These luxury goods not only changed the appearance of Roman women, but also influenced their social status and their relationships with their husbands and families. The breakdown of urban civilization, the rise of Christianity, and the invasions of various tribal peoples all contributed to changing women's roles and status. Some women found new opportunities in the chaos of imperial collapse, while others faced increased hardship and insecurity. The economic disruption of the 3rd century crisis affected women's lives in various ways. The decline of trade and urban life meant that many women lost access to the luxury goods and services that had defined upper-class life in the earlier empire. However, the breakdown of traditional social structures also created new opportunities for some women to achieve independence and influence. The rise of Christianity created new possibilities for women's religious life and spiritual development. Christian women could join religious communities, devote themselves to charitable work, and achieve recognition as martyrs and saints. However, Christianity also reinforced traditional gender hierarchies and created new forms of control over women's sexuality and reproductive choice. The barbarian invasions brought different cultural attitudes toward women into contact with Roman traditions. Some Germanic and Celtic societies had different marriage customs, property rights, and social expectations that influenced the development of medieval European society. The fusion of Roman, Christian, and barbarian traditions created new forms of gender relations that would shape European civilization for centuries to come. The transformation of the Roman Empire also changed the nature of women's work and economic activity. The decline of slavery meant that free women had to take on tasks that had previously been performed by slaves. The growth of rural estates and the decline of urban life meant that women were more likely to be involved in agricultural production and less likely to have access to education and cultural activity. The story of Roman women reveals the complex ways in which gender roles evolved in response to changing social, economic, and political conditions. Roman women enjoyed greater freedom and legal rights than women in most other ancient societies, but they were still subject to significant restrictions and limitations. Their experiences varied greatly depending on their social class, geographic location, and historical period. The legal innovations of Roman society, including the development of sophisticated property law and the concept of legal guardianship, influenced the treatment of women in later European society. The Roman ideal of the matrona, with her combination of domestic virtue and public dignity, provided a model for women's roles that persisted long after the fall of the empire. The religious life of Roman women, with its combination of traditional rituals and innovative mystery religions, demonstrated the important role that women could play in maintaining cultural traditions while adapting to new circumstances. The rise of Christianity within the Roman Empire created new opportunities for women's spiritual development, while also reinforcing traditional gender hierarchy. The cultural achievements of Roman women, from the poetry of Sulpicia to the political influence of imperial women like Livia and Julia Domna, demonstrate that women were capable of significant intellectual and political accomplishments when given the opportunity. Their stories remind us that the history of women's roles and rights is not a simple progression from oppression to liberation, but a complex process of negotiation and adaptation. The transformation of the Roman Empire and its eventual collapse created new challenges and opportunities for women that would shape the development of European civilization for centuries to come. The fusion of Roman, Christian, and barbarian traditions created new forms of gender relations that combined elements of all three cultures. Understanding the experiences of Roman women helps us to appreciate the complexity of social change and the various ways in which women have adapted to changing circumstances throughout history. The legacy of Roman women extends far beyond the boundaries of the ancient world. Their legal rights, their religious practices, their cultural achievements, and their social roles all contributed to the foundation of Western civilization and continue to influence our understanding of gender, family, and society. Roman women's economic activities were more extensive and sophisticated than those of women in most other ancient societies. While they were subject to legal restrictions that required guardian approval for major transactions, many women found ways to engage in business and accumulate substantial wealth. The surviving legal documents from Pompeii and other sites reveal that women were involved in lending money, owning rental properties, and managing commercial enterprises. Eumacia, a wealthy woman from Pompeii, provides an excellent example of female economic activity in the imperial period. She was a major patron of the Fullers' Guild and built a large commercial building in the Forum that served as their headquarters. Her activities demonstrate that women could play important roles in the economic life of their communities and that they were recognized and honored for their contributions. The wine trade was another area where Roman women were particularly active. Women inherited vineyards from their fathers and husbands and often managed these properties directly. They were involved in all aspects of wine production, from supervising the harvest to marketing the finished product. Some women became quite wealthy through their wine businesses and used their profits to support public works and charitable activities. The textile industry provided opportunities for women at all social levels. While upper-class women supervised textile production in their households, lower-class women worked as professional weavers, dyers, and seamstresses. Some women owned textile workshops and employed other women in their business. The production of luxury textiles for the wealthy created a substantial market for skilled female workers. Roman women were also involved in the banking and financial services that were essential to the empire's economy. While they could not serve as bankers themselves, they often provided capital for banking operations and received substantial profits from these investments. Some women became quite wealthy through their financial activities and used their wealth to support their families and community. The legal profession provided limited opportunities for women, as they were excluded from serving as judges or advocates. However, some women became skilled in legal matters and served as advisors to their male relatives. They were particularly knowledgeable about family law and property matters, areas that directly affected their own interests and those of their children. Roman women played important roles in healthcare and medical treatment, though their activities were often informal and unrecognized by male physicians. Women served as midwives, herbalists, and healers, drawing on traditional knowledge that had been passed down through generations of female practitioners. Their expertise was particularly valued in areas related to women's health and childbirth. The training of midwives was extensive and required considerable skill and knowledge. Experienced midwives instructed younger women in the techniques of childbirth, the use of medicinal herbs, and the care of newborns. Some midwives became quite prosperous and were highly respected in their communities. The best midwives were sought after by wealthy families and were well compensated for their service. Women's knowledge of herbal medicine was particularly extensive, as they were responsible for maintaining their family's health and treating common ailments. They cultivated medicinal plants in their gardens and prepared remedies for everything from headaches to digestive problems. This knowledge was often combined with religious practices and magical beliefs, creating a comprehensive system of healthcare that addressed both physical and spiritual needs. The care of the sick was considered a particularly appropriate activity for women, as it drew on their natural nurturing abilities and their responsibility for family welfare. Wealthy women often established hospitals and supported medical schools, while poorer women provided care for their neighbors and communities. The rise of Christianity increased opportunities for women to engage in charitable healthcare activities. Roman women also played important roles in the development of cosmetics and personal care products. They created recipes for perfumes, skin treatments, and hair care products that were often quite sophisticated. Some women became entrepreneurs in the beauty industry, manufacturing and selling cosmetics to other women throughout the empire. The entertainment industry provided opportunities for women to achieve fame and fortune, though these careers were often considered socially disreputable. Female actors, dancers, and musicians could become wealthy and influential, but they were excluded from respectable society and were often associated with prostitution and moral corruption. The most successful female entertainers were those who performed in the theatre and at public festivals. Some actresses became famous throughout the empire and were sought after by wealthy patrons. However, their social status remained low and they were subject to legal restrictions that limited their rights and opportunities. Female gladiators, though rare, provided spectacular entertainment for Roman audiences. These women trained extensively and fought with the same weapons and techniques as their male counterparts. While some gladiators were slaves forced to fight, others were free women who chose this dangerous profession for the potential rewards. The Emperor Domitian was particularly fond of female gladiatorial contests, and regularly featured them in his public games. Women also participated in the circus and other public entertainments as charioteers, acrobats, and animal trainers. These activities required considerable skill and courage, and successful performers could earn substantial income. However, like other forms of entertainment, these careers were considered beneath the dignity of respectable women. The patronage of the arts provided upper-class women with opportunities to influence cultural development without compromising their social state. Wealthy women sponsored poets, philosophers, and artists, and their support was essential to the flourishing of Roman culture. Some women became known for their literary salons and their ability to bring together the most talented writers and thinkers of their time. The experiences of women in the Roman provinces were shaped by the interaction between Roman law and local customs, creating a diverse range of practices and opportunities. In Egypt, for example, women had traditionally enjoyed greater legal rights than in other parts of the ancient world, and Roman rule initially allowed many of these practices to continue. Egyptian women could own property, engage in business, and represent themselves in court without male guardians. They could also initiate divorce proceedings, and had greater control over their children than Roman women. However, as Roman law became more fully implemented, some of these rights were restricted, and Egyptian women found themselves subject to the same limitations as their Roman counterparts. In Celtic regions like Britain and Gaul, women had traditionally held positions of religious and political authority that were unknown in Roman society. Some Celtic women served as rulers, warriors, and priestesses, roles that were completely foreign to Roman gender expectations. The process of Romanization gradually reduced these opportunities, but some Celtic women continued to exercise influence in their communities. The Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine had different marriage customs and property rights that influenced the development of law in the frontier regions. Germanic women often had greater control over their dowries and inheritances than Roman women, and these practices sometimes influenced local legal decisions, even within Roman territory. The Eastern Mediterranean regions had their own traditions regarding women's roles and rights. Greek women in the eastern provinces often maintained practices that were different from those in Rome, and Jewish women followed religious laws that sometimes conflicted with Roman legal requirements. The diversity of practices throughout the empire created a complex legal and social environment that required constant negotiation and adaptation. The increasing use of sign-manual marriage gave women greater legal independence and property rights, while the growth of divorce created new challenges for family stability and child welfare. The rise of companionate marriage based on mutual affection and shared interests rather than purely political or economic considerations can be seen in the correspondence of educated couples like Pliny and Calpurnia. These marriages often involved greater equality between spouses and more shared decision-making about family matters. The changing nature of the Roman family also affected women's roles and opportunity. The decline of the extended family household and the growth of smaller nuclear families meant that women had fewer female relatives to provide support and assistance. However, it also meant that they had greater autonomy within their own households and more direct control over their children's upbringing. The increasing mobility of Roman society, with families frequently moving between different parts of the empire, created new challenges for women's social networks and support systems. Women had to adapt to new communities and cultures while maintaining their family responsibilities and social obligations. The growth of urban centers throughout the empire created new opportunities for women's economic activities and social interaction. Urban women had access to markets, schools, and cultural activities that were unavailable to their rural counterparts. However, they also faced new challenges related to crime, disease, and social anonymity. While Roman women were excluded from military service, they played important supporting roles in the army and were significantly affected by military activities. The wives and daughters of soldiers often followed the legions, providing domestic services and emotional support to the troops. These women lived in the civilian settlements that grew up around military camps and often married soldiers after their discharge. Some women achieved fame for their connections to military activity. Agrippina the Elder, the wife of the popular general Germanicus, was celebrated for her courage and loyalty during military campaigns. She shared the hardships of camp life and provided moral support to the troops during difficult campaigns in Germany. The conquest of new territories often resulted in the enslavement of large numbers of women who were then distributed throughout the empire. These women faced particularly difficult challenges as they were separated from their families and cultures and forced to adapt to Roman society. Some were able to improve their situations through loyal service or by forming relationships with Roman men, but many remained in servitude throughout their lives. The military activities of the empire also created opportunities for some women to achieve wealth and influence. Women who provided supplies to the army, who lent money to soldiers, or who invested in military ventures, could profit substantially from Rome's military success. The wives and daughters of successful generals often used their military connections to advance their families' political and economic interests. The frontier regions of the empire were particularly dangerous for women, as they were vulnerable to raids and invasions by hostile tribes. Women living in these areas often had to develop survival skills and defensive capabilities that were unnecessary for their counterparts in more secure regions. Some women became skilled in the use of weapons and played active roles in defending their community. The ways in which Roman women were remembered after death reveal important aspects of their lives and social roles. Funerary inscriptions and tomb decorations provide valuable information about women's activities, relationships, and achievements. These sources show that women were remembered not only for their roles as wives and mothers, but also for their economic activities, charitable works, and personal qualities. The elaborate tombs of wealthy women demonstrate the importance of displaying family status and achievement. These monuments often included detailed sculptural programs that showed women engaged in various activities, from household management to religious ceremonies. The inscriptions on these tombs sometimes provide the only surviving records of women's accomplishments and contributions to their communities. The cult of the dead was an important aspect of Roman religious life, and women played crucial roles in maintaining the memory of deceased family members. They were responsible for conducting the rituals and ceremonies that ensured the continued welfare of the dead, and they often served as priestesses of family religious cults. Some women were honored with public funerals and monuments that recognized their contributions to their community. These commemorations often emphasized women's charitable activities, their support of public works, and their exemplary moral behavior. The surviving inscriptions from these monuments provide valuable information about the ways in which women could achieve public recognition and honor. The Christian period brought new forms of commemoration that emphasized women's spiritual achievements and their devotion to religious causes. Christian women were remembered as martyrs, saints, and charitable benefactors, and their stories provided models for other women to follow. The development of Christian burial practices created new opportunities for women to be remembered and honored after death. The story of Roman women reveals the complex and often contradictory nature of gender roles in ancient society. Roman women enjoyed greater freedom and legal rights than women in most other ancient cultures, but they were still subject to significant restrictions and limitations. Their experiences varied greatly depending on their social class, geographic location, and historical period, but all shared the common challenge of navigating between traditional expectations and changing social reality. The legal innovations of Roman society, including the development of sophisticated property law and the concept of legal guardianship, had a lasting influence on the treatment of women in later European societies. The Roman emphasis on written law and legal procedure provided a framework for protecting women's rights that was more systematic and comprehensive than the customary practices of other ancient cultures. The religious life of Roman women, with its combination of traditional state religion and innovative mystery cults, demonstrated the important role that women could play in maintaining cultural traditions while adapting to new spiritual needs. The rise of Christianity within the Roman Empire created new opportunities for women's religious participation, while also reinforcing traditional gender hierarchies. The cultural achievements of Roman women, from the poetry of Sulpicia to the political influence of imperial women like Livia and Julia Domna, demonstrate that women were capable of significant intellectual and political accomplishments when given the opportunity. Their stories remind us that the history of women's roles and rights is not a simple progression from oppression to liberation, but a complex process of negotiation and adaptation. The economic activities of Roman women, from household management to commercial enterprises, show that women were active participants in the economic life of the empire. Their contributions to textile production, trade, and financial services were essential to the functioning of Roman society, even when they were not fully recognized or rewarded for their effort. The transformation of the Roman Empire and its eventual collapse created new challenges and opportunities for women that would shape the development of European civilization for centuries to come. The fusion of Roman, Christian, and barbarian traditions created new forms of gender relations that combined elements of all three cultures. Understanding the experiences of Roman women helps us to appreciate the complexity of social change and the various ways in which women have adapted to changing circumstances throughout history. Their struggles and achievements provide valuable insights into the ongoing process of defining and redefining gender roles in human society. The legacy of Roman women continues to influence our understanding of gender, family, and society. Their legal rights, their religious practices, their cultural achievements, and their social roles all contributed to the foundation of Western civilization and continue to inspire women who seek to balance traditional expectations with personal ambitions and social change. The story of Roman women reminds us that the quest for gender equality is not a modern phenomenon, but an ongoing human struggle that has taken many different forms throughout history. As we near the end of our journey through the ancient world, let us pause to reflect on the common threads that wove through these women's lives across cultures and centuries. Despite the vast differences in time, place, and social organization, certain patterns emerge that reveal the universal aspects of women's experiences in the ancient world. Across all these civilizations, women's lives were fundamentally shaped by their biology and their role in reproduction. From the Sumerian priestesses who chose celibacy to escape marriage, to the Roman matrons who were honored for producing large families, women's value was primarily determined by their ability to bear and raise children. This biological reality created both opportunities and constraints that influenced every aspect of their lives. The legal systems of all these ancient civilizations treated women as dependents rather than independent agents. Whether under the authority of fathers, husbands, or male guardians, women were rarely free to make their own choices about marriage, property, or life direction. Yet within these constraints, women found ways to exercise agency and influence, often through indirect means and careful negotiation of social expectations. Religion provided one of the few areas where women could achieve public recognition and authority. From the Sumerian Naditu to the Roman Vestals, religious service offered alternatives to marriage and motherhood that could provide security, respect, and a degree of independence. The goddess figures that these women served, Inanna, Isis, Athena, and others, represented divine feminine power that mortal women could aspire to, but rarely achieve. The economic contributions of women were essential to the functioning of these ancient societies, yet they were rarely recognized or rewarded adequately. Women's work in textile production, food preparation, and household management was taken for granted, while their exclusion from most forms of public economic activity limited their ability to achieve financial independence. Education was another area where women faced systematic exclusion. While some women in all these cultures achieved literacy and learning, formal education was primarily reserved for men. This educational inequality reinforced other forms of gender discrimination and limited women's ability to participate fully in their society's intellectual and cultural life. The idealization of certain female virtues, modesty, obedience, fertility, and loyalty, served to control women's behavior while providing them with some protection and social recognition. Women who embodied these virtues could achieve respect and security, but those who challenged these expectations faced social ostracism, legal punishment, or worse. Violence against women was a constant threat in all these ancient societies. Women faced the dangers of domestic violence, sexual assault, and the hazards of childbirth, with limited legal protection or social support. The normalization of violence against women in law and custom created a climate of fear that shaped women's daily lives and choices. Yet despite these challenges, women in all these cultures found ways to create meaning, build relationships, and assert their humanity. They formed networks of support with other women, developed skills and knowledge that they passed down to their daughters, and found ways to influence their families and communities, even when formal power was denied to them. To truly comprehend the depth of women's experiences in the ancient world, we must examine how these societies systematically constructed barriers that shaped feminine existence from birth to death. The architecture of constraint was not merely a collection of random restrictions, but a carefully maintained system that served the interests of male-dominated social structures, while appearing to offer women protection and purpose. The marriage system across these civilizations functioned as the primary mechanism for transferring women between male-controlled households. In Mesopotamia, marriages were business transactions negotiated between fathers and prospective husbands, with women serving as both the commodity and the seal of the agreement. The bride price and dowry systems that developed across cultures reflected this economic reality, where women's value was literally calculated in terms of goods, land, and livestock. The concept of virginity as a form of property became central to women's identity and social worth. The elaborate rituals surrounding defloration, the severe punishments for adultery, and the premium placed on unmarried women all served to ensure that men could be certain of their paternity. This obsession with female chastity created a psychological prison for women, where their worth was tied to their sexual purity and their bodies were treated as vessels for male lineage rather than as their. The legal concept of coverture, though it would not be formally named until much later, existed in practice across these ancient societies. Women's legal existence was subsumed under that of their male guardians, making them invisible in courts, unable to own property in their own names, and incapable of entering into contracts. This legal erasure had profound psychological effects, teaching women from childhood that they were incomplete beings who required male supervision to function in society. The spatial segregation of women in these societies created both physical and psychological boundaries that reinforced their subordinate status. The women's quarters in wealthy households, the restrictions on women's movement in public spaces, and the requirement for male accompaniment all served to limit women's ability to form independent social networks and engage in economic activity. These spatial restrictions were often justified as protection, but they functioned as a form of house arrest, that prevented women from developing the skills and relationships necessary for independence. Perhaps nowhere was the complexity of women's position more evident than in the religious sphere, where the paradox of sacred femininity created both opportunities and additional constraints. The goddess figures that dominated ancient pantheons represented the very powers that mortal women were denied: autonomous sexuality, political authority, and the ability to shape destiny. This divine femininity served as both an inspiration and a reminder of what earthly women could not achieve. The role of priestesses in these societies reveals the intricate ways in which religious authority intersected with gender restriction. While priestesses could achieve considerable power and influence within temple hierarchies, their authority was always circumscribed by their service to divine beings and their separation from ordinary feminine roles. The requirement for celibacy among many priestesses can be understood as a trade-off. They gained religious authority by renouncing the reproductive sexuality that defined other women's lives. The mystery religions that emerged throughout the ancient world offered women some of the few opportunities for spiritual agency and community leadership. The cults of Demeter and Persephone, the worship of Cybele, and the mysteries of Isis provided spaces where women could serve as initiates, teachers, and ritual leaders. These religious contexts allowed women to exercise forms of authority that were denied to them in secular society, while creating networks of female solidarity that transcended class and ethnic boundaries. The prophetic traditions that developed in various cultures often recognized women as vessels for divine communication. The Pythia at Delphi, the Sibylline oracles, and the prophetesses mentioned in Hebrew scriptures all demonstrate that women's alleged emotional nature and spiritual sensitivity could be transformed from weaknesses into sources of religious authority. However, even these roles required women to surrender their individual identities to serve as mouthpieces for divine will. The seasonal festivals and women's religious observances created temporary spaces where normal social hierarchies could be suspended or even reversed. The Thesmophoria in Greece, the Bona Dea festival in Rome, and similar celebrations throughout the ancient world provided opportunities for women to gather without male supervision, to mock masculine authority, and to celebrate feminine power. These festivals served as crucial safety valves that allowed women to express frustrations and build solidarity, while ultimately reinforcing the social order by containing these expressions within acceptable religious contexts. The economic marginalization of women in ancient societies was not merely a byproduct of other forms of discrimination, but a deliberate strategy to maintain male control over resources and social power. By examining the systematic exclusion of women from profitable economic activities and their concentration in unpaid domestic labor, we can understand how economic dependency served as a foundation for broader patterns of subordination. The textile industry, which employed millions of women across the ancient world, illustrates the complex relationship between women's economic contributions and their social status. While women's skill in spinning, weaving, and cloth production was essential to their society's economic functioning, this work was consistently undervalued and poorly compensated. The idealization of women's textile work as a feminine virtue rather than skilled labor served to justify low wages and poor working conditions, while creating the illusion that women were fulfilling their natural roles rather than contributing to economic production. The exclusion of women from skilled trades and crafts was maintained through guild systems that passed knowledge and opportunities from fathers to sons. Women might assist in family workshops, but they were rarely recognized as independent craftspeople or allowed to take on apprentices. This systematic exclusion from skilled labor meant that women's economic options were limited to the most precarious and poorly paid forms of work, ensuring their continued dependence on male providers. The development of commercial agriculture in various ancient societies often displaced women from productive roles they had traditionally held. As farming shifted from subsistence to market production, women's knowledge of plant cultivation, animal husbandry, and food preservation became less valued than men's ability to negotiate in markets and manage large-scale operations. This transition from household to commercial production marked a significant loss of economic autonomy for women in many cultures. The legal restrictions on women's property ownership created additional barriers to economic independence. Even when women inherited wealth or earned income, their inability to control these resources independently meant that their economic contributions were always mediated through male guardians. The complex legal maneuvers that some women employed to circumvent these restrictions, such as using slaves as proxies for business transactions, demonstrate both the extent of these limitations and women's ingenuity in overcoming them. The sexual economy that developed in ancient urban centers created a parallel system where women's bodies became commodities in markets controlled by men. The regulation of prostitution, the taxation of brothels, and the legal status of sex workers all reveal how societies monetized female sexuality while denying women control over their own bodies. The existence of this sexual economy also served to reinforce the Madonna-whore dichotomy that divided women into categories of respectable and disreputable, with very different rights and protections for each group. The most insidious aspect of women's subordination in ancient societies was the way in which external constraints became internalized psychological barriers. The process by which women learned to accept, participate in, and even enforce their own oppression reveals the sophisticated mechanisms through which these societies maintained gender hierarchies without constant external coercion. The socialization of girls from early childhood involved a careful process of teaching them to value qualities that would make them attractive to men, while discouraging traits that might lead to independence or self-assertion. The emphasis on physical beauty, domestic skills, and emotional restraint served to channel women's energies into areas that would benefit others rather than themselves. The praise lavished on women who successfully embodied these ideals created a psychological reward system that encouraged conformity to restrictive gender roles. The concept of shame became a powerful tool for controlling women's behavior, particularly around sexuality and public visibility. The elaborate codes of modesty that developed in these societies created a form of self-surveillance, where women constantly monitored their own appearance, speech, and behavior to avoid social disapproval. This internalized shame served as a more effective control mechanism than external punishment, because it operated continuously and invisibly. The mother-daughter transmission of gender expectations created a cycle where women themselves became the primary enforcers of restrictions on other women. Mothers who had accepted the limitations placed on their own lives often worked to ensure that their daughters would fit successfully into the same constrained role. This intergenerational transmission of oppression was particularly effective because it was motivated by love and concern rather than hostility, making it difficult for recipients to recognize or resist. The development of what we might now recognize as symptoms of psychological trauma, depression, anxiety, dissociation, and self-harm can be traced in the limited records we have of women's inner lives in these ancient societies. The high rates of suicide among women in some cultures, the prevalence of hysteria and other unexplained illnesses, and the appeal of religious ecstasy all suggest that many women struggled with the psychological consequences of their constrained lives. The few women who managed to achieve unusual success or recognition often did so by adopting masculine traits and distancing themselves from other women. These exceptional women sometimes became the harshest critics of feminine behavior, using their unique positions to reinforce rather than challenge gender stereotypes. This pattern of successful women serving as enforcers of gender norms created additional barriers for other women seeking to transcend traditional limitation. Despite the overwhelming constraints they faced, women in ancient societies consistently found ways to create networks of support, resistance, and mutual aid that allowed them to survive and sometimes thrive within oppressive systems. These networks, often invisible to male observers and historians, represented crucial forms of agency and community that sustained women through their most difficult challenges. The informal networks that developed among women in extended households created support systems that could provide emotional sustenance, practical assistance, and collective protection. The relationships between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law, between wives and concubines, and between women of different social classes within the same household often transcended the competitive dynamics that men expected and created bonds of solidarity that could last lifetimes. The economic networks that women created through their domestic labor often served as informal systems of mutual aid and resource sharing. Women's exchanges of goods, services, and information created parallel economies that operated alongside but separate from male-dominated commercial systems. These networks allowed women to accumulate resources, develop skills, and build relationships that provided security and opportunities that were denied to them in formal economic systems. The knowledge-sharing networks that developed among women served as crucial systems for preserving and transmitting information about health, childbirth, childcare, and survival strategies. The midwives, healers, and wise women who served their communities created informal educational systems that provided women with practical knowledge and emotional support. These networks all served as spaces where women could develop and exercise leadership skills that were denied to them in other contexts. The religious and ritual networks that women created around life cycle events, birth, marriage, death, provided opportunities for female community and celebration that existed outside of male-controlled religious institutions. These women's rituals often incorporated elements of resistance to patriarchal authority, creating spaces where women could express frustrations, share advice, and build solidarity across social boundaries. The subversive networks that developed among women sometimes included explicit resistance to male authority and social The women who shared information about contraception and abortion, who helped other women escape abusive marriages, or who provided refuge for women in crisis, were engaging in forms of resistance that challenged fundamental assumptions about gender roles and male authority. These networks operated in secrecy and often at great personal risk, but they provided crucial support for women who needed to transcend or escape the limitations placed on their lives. The ancient world's understanding of feminine nature was not based on biological observation, but on cultural constructions that served the interests of male-dominated society. By examining how these cultures defined and explained women's supposed characteristics, we can understand how ideological systems supported and justified practical forms of oppression. The association of women with nature, emotion, and irrationality served to exclude them from the realms of culture, reason, and public life that were valued in these societies. This nature-culture dichotomy positioned women as closer to animals and natural forces, requiring civilizing influence from men to achieve fully human state. The elaboration of this dichotomy in philosophy, literature, and law created a comprehensive worldview that made women's subordination appear natural and inevitable. The medical theories that developed in various ancient cultures provided pseudo-scientific justifications for women's supposed inferiority and need for male guidance. The concept of the wandering womb in Greek medicine, the belief in women's inherent coldness and moisture in various humoral systems, and the theories about women's mental and physical weakness all serve to medicalize gender inequality and make it appear to be based on objective biological facts rather than social prejudice. The moral and ethical systems that developed in these societies consistently portrayed women as morally inferior to men, requiring constant guidance and supervision to behave ethically. The association of women with temptation, deception, and moral weakness created a framework that held women responsible for male misconduct, while denying them the agency to make independent moral choices. This moral framework was particularly evident in religious texts and legal codes that consistently blamed women for sexual crimes and social disruption. The intellectual traditions that emerged in the ancient world systematically excluded women from participation, while developing elaborate theories about their intellectual limitations. The belief that women were incapable of abstract reasoning, philosophical thought, or creative achievement was used to justify their exclusion from education and intellectual life. The few women who did achieve intellectual recognition were often portrayed as exceptional cases that proved the rule rather than evidence of women's general capability. The aesthetic ideals that developed around feminine beauty served to reduce women to objects of visual consumption, while creating impossible standards that encourage self-criticism and competition among women. The emphasis on physical perfection, youth, and sexual attractiveness made women's worth dependent on qualities that were largely outside their control and that inevitably diminished with age. These aesthetic standards also served to fragment women's identities, encouraging them to see themselves as collections of body parts rather than complete human beings. The experiences of women in ancient societies were shaped not only by gender, but by the complex intersections of class, ethnicity, age, and other social categories that created different forms of oppression and opportunity. Understanding these intersections is crucial for recognizing the diversity of women's experiences and the ways in which systems of oppression reinforced each other. The class divisions that structured these societies created vastly different experiences for women, depending on their economic position. Aristocratic women, while still subject to male authority, had access to education, leisure, and material comfort that were denied to poor women. However, their privileged position also came with additional restrictions on their behavior and mobility, as they were expected to serve as symbols of their family's status and virtue. The responsibilities of class could be as constraining as the hardships of poverty, creating different but equally limiting experiences for women across the social spectrum. The ethnic and cultural diversity within these ancient empires created additional layers of discrimination that affected women differently depending on their background. Foreign women, slaves, and members of conquered peoples faced forms of oppression that combined gender discrimination with ethnic prejudice and cultural imperialism. The sexual exploitation of foreign women, the forced assimilation of their children, and the appropriation of their cultural practices all demonstrate how empire and patriarchy reinforced each other in the treatment of marginalized women. The age-based hierarchies that existed within these societies created different experiences for women at different life stages. Young women were valued for their reproductive potential, but lacked the authority and knowledge that came with experience. Older women who had survived childbirth and gained wisdom often achieved greater respect and influence within their communities, but they also faced the loss of sexual value and the vulnerability that came with widowhood. The transition between these life stages was often marked by rituals and celebrations that helped women navigate changing social expectations. The religious and cultural minorities within these societies faced additional forms of discrimination that affected women in particular ways. Women from minority religious communities often faced restrictions on their religious practices, forced conversion, or persecution that targeted their roles as transmitters of cultural tradition. The intersection of religious and gender oppression created unique challenges for women who were already marginalized within their own communities. The physical and mental disabilities that affected some women in these societies created additional barriers to full participation in community life. The limited understanding of disability in the ancient world often resulted in women with disabilities being seen as cursed, possessed, or otherwise marked by divine displeasure. The economic and social vulnerabilities that affected all women were magnified for those with disabilities, who often faced abandonment, exploitation, or throughout the ancient world. We can trace the gradual development of what we might recognize as feminist consciousness, the recognition that women's subordination was not natural or inevitable, but was the result of human choices that could be changed. This evolution of consciousness was slow and often contradictory, but it laid the foundation for later movements toward gender equality. The earliest forms of feminist consciousness often emerged within religious contexts, where women had access to alternative models of feminine power and authority. The goddess traditions that celebrated female strength, wisdom, and independence provided women with conceptual frameworks for imagining different possibilities for their lives. The women who served these goddesses sometimes developed critiques of male authority that challenged fundamental assumptions about gender roles and social organization. The legal reforms that gradually expanded women's rights in some ancient societies reflected both changing social conditions and women's own advocacy for better treatment. The Roman women who petitioned for the repeal of the Oppian Law, the women who demanded inheritance rights, and those who fought for legal protection from domestic violence, all demonstrated that women were capable of collective action and political advocacy when circumstances. The literary works created by women in these societies often contained subtle critiques of gender inequality and expressions of longing for greater freedom and recognition. The poetry of Sappho, the writings of women philosophers, and the letters and diaries that have survived from various cultures all reveal women's growing awareness of their own capabilities and the artificial nature of the restrictions placed on their lives. The educational movements that gradually expanded women's access to literacy and learning created new possibilities for women's intellectual development and social criticism. The women who learned to read and write often used these skills to communicate with other women, to record their experiences, and to challenge prevailing ideas about feminine nature and capability. The spread of literacy among women created the foundation for later feminist movements, by providing women with the tools to articulate their experiences and organize for change. The economic changes that gradually expanded women's opportunities for independent work and income created new possibilities for women's autonomy and self-determination. The women who became successful merchants, craftspeople, or professionals often used their economic independence to support other women and to challenge social expectations about women's roles. These economic pioneers demonstrated that women were capable of succeeding in realms that had been considered exclusively masculine. The stories of exceptional women, queens, priestesses, and others who achieved unusual prominence should not obscure the reality that most women lived lives of hardship and limitation. However, these exceptional women also demonstrate that the constraints placed on women were social constructions rather than natural laws, and that individual women could sometimes transcend these limitations through intelligence, courage, and favorable circumstance. The mythology and literature of these ancient cultures often featured powerful female figures who embodied both the aspirations and the fears that these societies held about women. Goddesses like Inanna, Isis, and Athena represented divine feminine power, while mortal women like Penelope and Lucretia embodied the virtues that were expected of earthly women. These stories provided models for women to emulate and reflected the complex attitudes that their societies held about feminine nature and potential. The gradual changes in women's status over time in some of these cultures, particularly in Rome, demonstrate that gender roles were not fixed, but could evolve in response to social, economic, and political change. The expansion of women's rights and opportunities in later periods of Roman history shows that progress was possible, even if it was slow and incomplete. The intersection of class, ethnicity, and gender created different experiences for women within each of these societies. Aristocratic women had opportunities and privileges that were denied to poor women, while foreign women and slaves faced additional forms of discrimination and exploitation. These intersections remind us that women's experiences were not uniform but varied significantly based on their social position and circumstances. The legacy of these ancient attitudes toward women would influence Western civilization for millennia. The legal traditions, philosophical ideas, and social customs that developed in these ancient societies provided the foundation for later European and American culture. Understanding these historical roots helps us comprehend the persistence of gender inequality and the ongoing struggle for women's rights. The legal codes that emerged from these ancient societies continued to influence European law through the medieval period, and the Roman law traditions that treated women as perpetual minors, the Germanic customs that emphasized male guardianship, and the religious laws that restricted women's participation in public life, all left lasting marks on Western legal tradition. The principle of coverture, the restrictions on women's property rights, and the legal tolerance for domestic violence all had their roots in these ancient legal systems. The philosophical traditions that developed in the ancient world provided intellectual frameworks that were used to justify women's subordination for centuries. The Aristotelian ideas about women's natural inferiority, the Platonic concepts of gender complementarity, and the Stoic ideals of feminine virtue all became part of the intellectual heritage that shaped Western thought about gender. These philosophical traditions provided sophisticated justifications for practical forms of oppression that made gender inequality appear to be based on reason and natural law rather than social prejudice. The religious traditions that emerged from the ancient world carried forward many of the attitudes and practices that had restricted women's roles and opportunity. The Christian tradition's emphasis on female submission, the Islamic traditions regarding women's roles, and the Jewish laws governing women's participation in religious life all reflected and perpetuated many of the gender restrictions that had developed in their ancient context. The idealization of feminine sacrifice and suffering, the emphasis on women's moral weakness, and the restriction of women's religious authority all became central elements of Western religious tradition. The economic systems that developed in later periods continued to reflect the ancient world's devaluation of women's work and restriction of their economic opportunity. The guild systems of medieval Europe, the exclusion of women from emerging capitalist enterprises, and the development of separate spheres ideology all had their roots in ancient practices that had confined women to domestic roles and unpaid labor. The persistent wage gaps, occupational segregation, and economic dependency that characterized women's lives in later periods all reflected the continuation of economic patterns that had been established in the ancient world. The cultural attitudes toward women that developed in these ancient societies became deeply embedded in Western literature, art, and popular culture. The stereotypes of women as emotional, irrational, and morally weak, the idealization of feminine beauty and youth, and the fear of feminine power and sexuality all became recurring themes in Western cultural expression. These cultural attitudes shaped how women were perceived and how they perceived themselves, creating psychological barriers that persisted long after legal and economic restrictions had been formally removed. As we conclude this exploration of women's lives in the ancient world, we are struck by both the historical specificity of these experiences and their enduring relevance to contemporary struggles for gender equality. The patterns of subordination, resistance, and gradual change that we have traced through these ancient societies continue to resonate in modern contexts, reminding us that the struggle for women's rights is not a recent phenomenon, but a continuing human endeavor that spans millennia. The systematic nature of women's oppression in these ancient societies demonstrates that gender inequality was not the result of individual prejudice or temporary social conditions, but was embedded in the fundamental structures of law, religion, economics, and culture. This systematic oppression required constant maintenance and reinforcement, suggesting that it was not natural or inevitable, but was the result of human choices that could be changed through human action. The resilience and creativity that women demonstrated in finding ways to survive and thrive within these oppressive systems provide inspiration for contemporary struggles against gender inequality. The networks of support, the strategies of resistance, and the gradual development of feminist consciousness that we have traced through these ancient societies offer models and hope for current efforts to achieve gender equality. The diversity of women's experiences across different cultures, classes, and historical periods reminds us that there is no single story of women's oppression or liberation. The intersections of gender with other forms of social difference created unique challenges and opportunities that varied significantly across time and place. This diversity suggests that effective strategies for promoting gender equality must be sensitive to local contexts and cultural specificities, while recognizing the universal human desire for dignity, freedom, and opportunity. The gradual changes in women's status that occurred in some ancient societies demonstrate that progress is possible, even within seemingly immutable social systems. The legal reforms, educational opportunities, and economic developments that gradually expanded women's rights and opportunities in places like Rome show that social change is possible when women organize, advocate, and persist in their efforts to achieve equality. The continuation of ancient attitudes and practices into later historical periods reminds us that social change is slow and often incomplete. The persistence of legal, economic, and cultural restrictions on women's lives demonstrates that formal equality is not sufficient to achieve genuine gender equality. The psychological and cultural barriers that were established in these ancient societies continue to influence contemporary attitudes and behaviors, suggesting that the struggle for gender equality must address not only legal and economic inequalities, but also the deeper cultural and psychological patterns that sustain gender discrimination. The study of women's lives in the ancient world ultimately reveals both the depth of the challenges that women have faced throughout history and the persistence of their efforts to achieve dignity, recognition, and equality. The voices of these ancient women, preserved in fragmentary records and archaeological evidence, speak to us across the centuries with messages of strength, wisdom, and hope that continue to inspire and guide contemporary efforts to build a more just and equitable world. Their stories remind us that while the specific forms of gender inequality may change over time, the underlying human desires for freedom, recognition, and opportunity remain constant. The struggles of these ancient women were not in vain. They laid the foundation for the progress that later generations would achieve, and continue to inspire efforts to complete the work of achieving true gender equality. As we move forward in our own struggles for justice and equality, we carry with us the wisdom, courage, and determination of these ancient women who refused to accept the limitations placed on their lives, and who worked, within the constraints of their historical moment, to create better possibilities for themselves and for the women who would follow. Their legacy reminds us that the struggle for gender equality is not merely a contemporary political cause, but a fundamental human endeavor that connects us across time and culture to the deepest aspirations of the human spirit. As we reach the end of our journey through the ancient world, let us reflect on the profound continuities that connect these distant women's lives to our own time. Across the vast expanse of history, from the earliest cuneiform tablets to the marble inscriptions of imperial Rome, we find evidence of the same fundamental human struggles: the desire for dignity, the need for security, the quest for agency in determining one's own fate, and the enduring power of hope in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. These ancient women lived in societies that were both magnificent and oppressive, cultures that created great art, literature, and technological innovations, while systematically denying basic freedoms to half their population. They found ways to love, to create, to influence, and to endure within systems that sought to limit their potential and reduce them to their biological functions. Their stories remind us that the struggle for equality and respect is not new, but as old as civilization itself. The resilience of these women is perhaps their most remarkable characteristic. Despite facing legal discrimination, social restrictions, economic dependence, and the constant threat of violence, they found ways to create meaningful lives and to pass on their knowledge, skills, and values to future generations. They built networks of support with other women, developed informal sources of power and influence, and maintained their dignity even in the most difficult circumstances. In the clay tablets of Sumer, we find business records kept by women who managed household economies and engaged in trade. In the papyri of Egypt, we discover love letters written by women who found ways to express their emotions and desires despite social constraints. In the pottery shards of Athens, we see evidence of women's religious participation and community involvement. In the stone inscriptions of Rome, we read epitaphs that celebrate women's achievements and mourn their losses. The goddesses these women worshipped, Inanna, Isis, Athena, and Diana, reflected both their aspirations and their limitations. These divine figures possessed the power and freedom that mortal women were denied, yet they also reinforced the stereotypes and expectations that bound women to particular roles and behavior. The stories of these goddesses provided comfort and inspiration to women who saw in them reflections of their own struggles and dreams. The legal codes, philosophical treatises, and literary works that these ancient societies produced reveal the complex and often contradictory attitudes toward women that shaped their daily lives. Women were simultaneously idealized and demonized, protected and controlled, honored and oppressed. These contradictions reflect the fundamental tensions in societies that depended on women's contributions, while denying them full participation in public life. The exceptional women who achieved prominence in these ancient societies, rulers like Hatshepsut and Cleopatra, religious leaders like the Vestal Virgins, intellectuals like Aspasia, demonstrate that the constraints placed on women were social constructions rather than natural laws. These women showed that when given opportunities, women could achieve the same levels of intelligence, creativity, and leadership as men. Their examples inspired other women and challenged the assumptions about female inferiority that justified gender discrimination. Yet we must not romanticize these ancient women's lives or minimize the very real hardships they faced. The mortality rates in childbirth, the prevalence of domestic violence, the economic insecurity, and the legal powerlessness that characterized most women's lives created genuine suffering and limitation. Many women died young, never having had the opportunity to develop their full potential or to see their dreams realized. The religious and cultural traditions that developed in these ancient societies provided both support and constraint for women. Religious participation offered opportunities for community involvement and spiritual fulfillment, but religious ideology also reinforced gender hierarchies and justified women's subordination. The celebration of female virtues like modesty, obedience, and self-sacrifice provided women with social recognition and protection, but it also limited their freedom and autonomy. The economic systems of these ancient societies depended heavily on women's labor, both in the domestic sphere and in various forms of craft production and trade. Yet women's economic contributions were often invisible and unrewarded, and their exclusion from many forms of public economic activity limited their ability to achieve financial independence. The gender division of labor that characterized these societies created mutual dependence between men and women, but it also reinforced power imbalances that disadvantaged women. The educational systems that developed in these ancient cultures systematically excluded women from formal learning and intellectual development. While some women achieved literacy and learning through informal means, the restriction of education to men reinforced other forms of gender discrimination and limited women's ability to participate fully in their society's intellectual and cultural life. The few women who did achieve education often used it to support their families or to participate in religious activities, rather than to pursue independent careers or intellectual development. The family structures that characterized these ancient societies provided women with some protection and support, but they also created dependencies and limitations that constrained women's choices and opportunities. The emphasis on patriarchal authority and patrilineal inheritance meant that women's identities and status were largely determined by their relationships to men, rather than by their own achievements or characteristics. The violence against women that was endemic in these ancient societies, domestic violence, sexual assault, and the hazards of childbirth, created a climate of fear and vulnerability that shaped women's daily lives and choices. The normalization of violence against women in law and custom, combined with women's legal powerlessness, created situations where women had little recourse against abuse and exploitation. Despite these challenges, women in these ancient societies found ways to create beauty, meaning, and connection in their lives. They developed rich traditions of storytelling, music, and crafts that preserved cultural knowledge and value. They formed friendships and alliances with other women that provided emotional support and practical assistance. They found ways to influence their families and communities, even when formal power was denied to them. The myths, legends, and stories that these ancient cultures produced often featured strong female characters who embodied both